My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Dad's wife will be there, she said, standing in the doorway of the $2 million penthouse her father bought her. We want her to feel like she is part of the family. I did not argue. I simply turned around and went back to base for another Christmas on duty. But at exactly midnight, my daughter called me crying hysterically. Mom, why did the Pentagon just call Dad? My name is Rebecca, 35 years old and a major at United States Cyber Command. Before I tell you exactly how I brought down my ex-husband's corrupt defense empire on Christmas Eve, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly sharpen your blade while someone else took credit for your life. The snow was falling heavily over Northern Virginia when I pulled up to the luxury high-rise building. I was wearing my formal service dress uniform, the crisp fabric a stark contrast to the holiday excess dripping from the building's lobby. In my hands, I held a small, carefully wrapped box. It contained a vintage compass, the exact kind my grandfather used to navigate cross-country. It was not a designer handbag or the keys to a sports car, but it had meaning. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, my heart heavy, but my posture perfectly straight. When the heavy mahogany door swung open, Madison stood there. My beautiful 18-year-old daughter was draped in a silk dress that cost more than my first car. The blaring sound of holiday jazz and clinking crystal glasses spilled out from the penthouse behind her. She looked at me, her eyes darting nervously back toward the massive living room. Mom, you cannot come in right now. Madison shifted her weight, blocking the entrance. Dad's wife will be there. We want her to feel like she is part of the family tonight. The words felt rehearsed, sterile, completely devoid of the warmth we used to share. Before I could process the sting of my own daughter treating me like a stranger, the sharp clicking of designer heels echoed on the marble floor. Vanessa appeared behind Madison. At 28, my ex-husband's new wife was a walking billboard for his ill-gotten wealth. She held a flute of champagne, her lips curled into a condescending smirk as she looked me up and down. I see you wore your little work outfit, Rebecca, Vanessa said, taking a sip of her drink. Did you really think it was appropriate to show up here looking like a security guard? Bradley has important government contractors inside. People who actually make decisions, not the ones who just follow orders. I kept my hands steady, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately craved. I came to drop off a gift for my daughter, Vanessa. That is all. Vanessa laughed a high and grating sound. She stepped past Madison, positioning herself firmly in the doorway. Go back to your barracks, Rebecca. You gave up your right to be a mother at 17 when you could not even afford diapers. Bradley gave her everything while you were off playing soldier because you were too poor to raise her. Do not try to play the devoted mother now just because you managed to scrape together enough pennies for whatever cheap trinket is in that box. The history she threw in my face was a twisted version of the truth. I was a teenage mother trapped in extreme poverty. I had made the agonizing decision to surrender primary custody to Bradley's wealthy family so Madison would not go hungry, joining the military to build a future for myself and eventually for her. Bradley had spent the next 15 years using his wealth to alienate me, brainwashing our daughter into believing I had simply abandoned her. I looked at Madison. She dropped her gaze to the floor, clearly ashamed but too deeply manipulated by her father's money to defend me. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply placed the small wrapped box on the console table near the door. Merry Christmas, Madison. I said, my voice steady and commanding. Remember what I taught you about finding your true north. I turned and walked back toward the elevator without waiting for a response. I did not look back when the heavy oak door clicked shut. The drive back to the Pentagon was bitterly cold. The dark roads were nearly empty as the city settled in for the holiday. As I navigated the icy highway, the secure cell phone in my center console vibrated. I glanced at the screen. It was DeAndre. DeAndre was a 40-year-old financial forensic auditor, a former military man, and tragically the husband of Bradley's incredibly toxic sister Caroline. He was the only person in that entire social circle who saw through Bradley's flawless facade. We shared a quiet, unspoken mutual respect, bound by our shared understanding of duty and honor. I answered the call through the car's Bluetooth system. Merry Christmas, DeAndre. I just watched Vanessa toss your present down the garbage chute, DeAndre said, his deep voice heavy with quiet anger. I am sorry, Rebecca. I tried to grab it, but she was too fast. They are filling Madison's head with lies again. Bradley is in the living room bragging to the guests, calling you a government pawn making a pathetic salary who walked out on a toddler. I kept my eyes on the snowy road ahead, my grip on the steering wheel completely relaxed. It is fine, DeAndre. They have laughed at my expense long enough. I am used to being their favorite joke. You do not deserve this, he continued, the frustration evident over the line. Caroline is just as bad parading around in diamonds. Bradley bought her acting like they own the city. It makes me sick to sit at this table. I smiled softly in the darkness of the car. Let them drink their champagne, DeAndre. Let them enjoy every single drop. But do me a favor. What is that? He asked. Tell your wife not to max out her credit cards tonight, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. The federal freeze hits at exactly midnight. The biometric scanner at the entrance of the subterranean Pentagon level flashed green. Heavy steel doors hissed open, granting me access to the U.S. Cyber Command operations floor. The air inside was chilled to exactly 64 degrees to keep the server towers cool, completely isolated from the freezing Virginia snowstorm raging above ground. Dozens of glowing monitors illuminated the faces of my team. They had been working around the clock for 36 hours straight. Major Thorne on deck, Lieutenant Miller announced, standing at attention as I walked past the rows of analysts. At ease, Miller. Give me the final status report, I said, stripping off my dress coat and sliding into the leather command chair at the central console. Miller handed me a thick, red-banded dossier. The gold foil seal of the Department of Defense gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. We have locked onto all 72 offshore accounts, Major. The routing numbers in the Cayman Islands, the shell corporations in Panama, and the blind trusts in Switzerland. We successfully traced the missing $80 million from the Infantry Body Armor Initiative directly into Bradley Hayes's personal portfolios. I opened the dossier. Staring back at me were 3 years of meticulous, exhausting, classified forensic tracking. Bradley thought he was a genius. He thought hiding stolen government funds behind a labyrinth of fake defense subcontractors would make him invisible. He underestimated the woman he had spent 15 years calling a failure. He never realized that the penniless teenage mother he forced out of her daughter's life had climbed the ranks to become the apex predator of digital warfare. Have the Treasury Department and the FBI confirmed their positions? I asked, picking up a tactical pen. Treasury cyber units are on standby to execute the freeze order across all global banking networks, Miller confirmed. The FBI tactical teams are in the lobby of his building. They are just waiting for your final authorization. I looked at the digital clock mounted on the far wall of the command center. It read 11:55, 5 minutes until Christmas Day. I flipped to the final page of the dossier. The signature line demanded the authorization of the senior intelligence officer. I pressed the pen to the paper. Execute the freeze at exactly midnight, I ordered, signing my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. Shut it all down. Burn his empire to the ground. Yes, Major. Miller took the dossier, his fingers flying across his keyboard. 20 miles away, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine swinging down toward his neck, Bradley stood in the center of his $2 million penthouse living room. He held a crystal tumbler of aged scotch, surrounded by a circle of defense lobbyists, local politicians, and wealthy socialites. The room smelled of expensive catered truffles and fresh pine from a towering, professionally decorated Christmas tree. I am telling you, the future of military contracting is purely automated, Bradley boasted loudly, making sure his voice carried over the soft jazz playing from the hidden surround sound speakers. The Pentagon just approved my firm for a new drone navigation contract. $150 million. It is child's play, really. The government throws money at anyone who knows how to draft a decent proposal. You just have to know which palms to grease. The sycophants surrounding him laughed on cue. Vanessa stood at his side, draped in a backless silver gown, resting her hand on his chest. A massive diamond tennis bracelet sparkled on her wrist, paid for by funds stolen from the very soldiers I commanded. Bradley is simply a visionary, Vanessa purred, leaning into him. "We are actually flying to the Maldives next week to celebrate. Taking the private jet, of course. Commercial flying is just too chaotic these days." Across the room, Bradley's sister Caroline was aggressively signaling a bartender to refill her glass with vintage Pinot Noir. Her husband DeAndre stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the falling snow with a completely blank expression. He checked his stainless steel watch. 11:58. Madison sat awkwardly on a white leather sofa nearby, picking at her manicured nails. She looked down at the expensive silk dress Vanessa had forced her to wear. The harsh words Vanessa had hurled at me earlier that evening still echoed in the vast room, but Bradley had simply laughed them off, praising his new wife for finally putting the trash in its place. "You should have seen her face," Bradley sneered to a laughing congressman. "Rebecca showed up here in her little uniform looking like a glorified mall cop. I tried to tell her years ago that the military is for people who cannot cut it in the real world. She could not afford to raise Madison back then, and she certainly cannot afford to walk in our circles now." DeAndre took a slow sip of his sparkling water, his eyes fixed on the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. The brass pendulum swung back and forth. 11:59. "Anyway," Bradley chuckled, raising his glass for a toast. "To the New Year, gentlemen. To bigger contracts, weaker oversight, and absolute prosperity." The grandfather clock began to chime. Midnight. Before anyone could raise their glasses, the sharp, piercing ring of Bradley's custom cell phone shattered the celebratory mood. He pulled it from his tailored suit jacket, annoyed at the interruption. The caller ID flashed on the bright screen. "Department of Defense." Bradley smirked, holding the phone up for his audience to see. "Duty calls, gentlemen. Probably some general needing his hand held through a software update. Let us put him on speaker so you can hear how these brass hats beg." Bradley tapped the screen and confidently answered the call. "Bradley Hayes speaking. Merry Christmas, who am I talking to?" "Mr. Hayes, this is the United States Department of Defense Security Clearance Adjudication Facility." A cold, clinical voice announced through the phone's speaker. "Be advised that effective immediately, your top-secret security clearance has been permanently revoked under the authority of the Espionage Act." The laughter in the room died instantly. Bradley's smug smile vanished, replaced by an angry scowl. "What the hell are you talking about? Is this a joke? Who is your commanding officer? This is not a joke. Mr. Hayes, you are currently under federal indictment for embezzlement, wire fraud, and treason. All personal and corporate assets linked to your name, including offshore holdings, have been seized by the Department of the Treasury. Have a pleasant evening." The line went dead. Bradley stared at the phone, his face draining of color. Vanessa grabbed his arm, her diamond bracelets clinking. "Bradley, what does that mean? What did they mean, seized?" Before Bradley could formulate a lie to calm the panicked room, a loud chime echoed through the penthouse. The heavy brass doors of the private keycard-only elevator slid open. Federal agents clad in tactical gear and windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters FBI poured into the foyer, assault rifles raised and flashlights blinding the high society guests. "Nobody move," the lead agent roared, his voice booming over the jazz music. "Bradley Hayes, put your hands where I can see them. You are under arrest." The jazz music abruptly died, replaced by the frantic shrieks of Washington's elite. Women in designer gowns scrambled backward, their champagne flutes shattering against the imported hardwood floors. Bradley stood frozen by the towering Christmas tree, the crystal tumbler slipping from his grip and splashing aged scotch across the toes of his custom Italian leather shoes. "Are you out of your mind?" Bradley bellowed, recovering his characteristic arrogance as he puffed out his chest. "Do you have any idea who I am? I have 4-star generals on speed dial. I play golf with the Secretary of Defense. Get out of my penthouse right now before I end every single one of your careers." The lead agent did not even blink. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, grabbed Bradley by the lapels of his tailored suit, and slammed him chest first against the massive marble kitchen island. "Bradley Hayes, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, treason, and the embezzlement of federal defense funds," the agent barked, roughly pulling Bradley's arms behind his back. The sharp snap of steel handcuffs echoed through the sudden silence of the room. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. This is a massive mistake, Bradley choked out, his face pressed painfully against the cold stone. Call Colonel Mitchell. Call him right now. He will clear this entire misunderstanding up in 5 minutes. The agent leaned down, his voice low and entirely devoid of sympathy. Colonel Mitchell cannot help you tonight. The arrest warrant came directly from United States Cyber Command. Across the room, Vanessa backed slowly away from the kitchen island. Her eyes darted toward the private elevator, then down to the platinum smartphone clutched in her trembling hands. While the federal agent secured the perimeter and began aggressively confiscating laptops and physical files from the home office, she slipped behind a towering floral arrangement near the balcony. Her manicured fingers flew across her screen, frantically dialing her private aviation concierge. "Yes, this is Vanessa Hayes," she whispered fiercely into the receiver, keeping her back to the agents. "I need a private charter to Paris tonight. I do not care about flight clearances, and I do not care what it costs. Just put it on the black card and have a car waiting downstairs in 10 minutes." She waited, tapping her diamond-studded heel against the floor, her breathing shallow and rapid. A moment later, the color drained from her face entirely. "What do you mean, declined?" Vanessa hissed, no longer bothering to hide her mounting panic. "That card has no limit. Run it again. Try the offshore account. Try the Swiss routing number. Just get me a flight out of this country." The voice on the other end delivered a message that made her drop the phone. It clattered heavily to the hardwood floor. Every single account was frozen. The checking accounts, the offshore trusts, the emergency funds hidden in the Caymans. A blanket federal asset freeze had swept across the globe at exactly midnight, incinerating their financial empire in a matter of seconds. The concierge informed her that even the credit cards under her maiden name were locked by the Department of Justice. Vanessa let out a raw, guttural scream, sinking to her knees in her silver gown. The facade of the untouchable, wealthy socialite vanished instantly, replaced by the terrified reality of a woman who just realized she was completely broke. She grabbed at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, realizing the feds would be seizing that next. Caroline Bradley's sister lunged forward through the crowd of terrified guests, nearly tripping over her own evening gown. She grabbed her husband DeAndre by the arm, her fingernails digging frantically into his suit jacket. "Do something!" Caroline shrieked, her face twisted in absolute hysteria. "Call your firm. Get the best corporate lawyers on the phone right now. Tell these thugs they cannot do this to my brother. We are prominent citizens. DeAndre, make it stop." DeAndre did not move a single muscle to help her. He looked down at the woman he had married, a woman whose entire luxurious lifestyle was funded by the blood money her brother stole from the military. He calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off his jacket one by one. "I told you to be careful with your credit cards tonight, Caroline," DeAndre said, his voice a steady, calm baritone amid the absolute chaos of the room. "I cannot stop the federal government from taking back what was stolen. Nobody can." Caroline stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in profound shock. "You knew," she gasped, stumbling backward, as if he had struck her. "You knew this was going to happen, and you did nothing to warn us." Before she could launch into another hysterical fit or swing at him, DeAndre stepped away from her. He moved directly across the room to where Madison stood. The 18-year-old was backed into a corner near the hallway, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Her entire reality, the wealth, the extreme privilege, the untouchable father she idolized, was burning to ash right in front of her. The federal agents were aggressively shoving her father toward the elevator, his head bowed, his arrogance completely shattered. DeAndre placed his broad shoulders between Madison and the armed agents, shielding her from the brunt of the violence and the blinding flashlights. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Breathe, Madison," he instructed quietly. "Just breathe. Do not look at them." Madison shook her head wildly, tears spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. She stumbled backward away from DeAndre, pulling her cell phone from her designer clutch. Her hands shook so violently she could barely unlock the screen. She bypassed her father's number, bypassed Vanessa's, and hit the only contact she knew represented safety, even if she had spent the last 5 years pushing her away. The phone rang twice. "Mom." Madison sobbed, her voice cracking loudly as she pressed the phone hard against her ear. Mom, you have to help us. Something terrible is happening. I sat in the command chair at the Pentagon, staring at the digital grid that confirmed the successful extraction of Bradley Hayes. The heavy, focused silence of the operations floor surrounded me, a sharp contrast to the panic I could hear bleeding through the phone line. Madison. I am here, I said, my voice projecting a calm, unyielding authority. They took Dad. Madison cried hysterically, her panic echoing through the receiver. Men with guns came into the penthouse. They put him in handcuffs. They are taking him away. You have to tell them there is a mistake. You work for the military, Mom. You have to call someone and tell them they took my dad by mistake. I let her catch her breath, listening to the frantic background noise of the penthouse I had stood in just an hour prior. I could hear Vanessa sobbing in the distance and the stern voices of agents securing the crime scene. There is no mistake, Madison, I said, my voice cold professional steel. I know exactly who took your father. What do you mean? Madison choked out, her breath hitching. Where are they taking him? I stood up from the command chair, smoothing the lapels of my uniform. I picked up the red dossier from the console. They are bringing him to me, Madison. I am waiting for him in interrogation room 4. The sterile white noise of the ventilation system in interrogation room 4 hummed in the background. The space was a windowless concrete box buried deep within the secure sublevels of the Pentagon, designed specifically to strip away a person's sense of power. I stood in the observation corridor, watching through the two-way glass, as Bradley paced the length of the small room like a caged animal. His custom-tailored Italian suit was already rumpled from the rough handling by the federal agents. His silk tie hung loose around his neck. He was red in the face, shouting at the stoic military police officer guarding the heavy steel door. I demand to speak to a general right now, Bradley bellowed, slamming his palm against the stainless steel table bolted to the floor. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I have dinner with the Joint Chiefs. I supply the software that runs your entire logistics grid. Get me someone with actual stars on their shoulders, or I will personally see to it that you are scrubbing latrines in Alaska by morning. The military police officer did not blink, standing at parade rest with his hands clasped firmly behind his back. I adjusted the cuffs of my service dress uniform, feeling the familiar grounding weight of the fabric. The brass buttons and the rows of colorful commendation ribbons pinned to my chest caught the dim light of the corridor. I took a slow, deep breath, letting 15 years of humiliation, poverty, and silent endurance settle into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I swiped my security badge over the keypad. The heavy deadbolt retracted with a loud mechanical clank. The steel door swung open. The military police officer immediately snapped to attention, saluting sharply as I crossed the threshold. Leave us, I commanded. Yes, Major, the guard replied, stepping out and pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The lock engaged, sealing Bradley and me inside the suffocatingly quiet room. Bradley spun around his chest, heaving with arrogant rage, ready to unleash another tirade on whatever commanding officer had just walked in. But the words died in his throat. His eyes widened, scanning my polished black shoes, traveling up the dark blue trousers, lingering on the gold oak leaf insignia on my shoulders, and finally resting on my face. For 10 agonizing seconds, the great Bradley Hayes could not form a single coherent word. The cognitive dissonance was breaking his brain. He was trying to reconcile the image of the penniless, desperate 17-year-old girl he had bullied into surrendering her own child with the formidable high-ranking military officer standing before him. Rebecca Bradley breathed out, his voice dripping with absolute bewilderment. What kind of sick joke is this? What are you doing in here? Did they hire you to bring me coffee? I did not answer him immediately. I walked to the metal table with deliberate, measured steps and pulled out the single steel chair opposite him. I sat down, keeping my spine perfectly straight, resting my hands comfortably on the cold metal surface. Sit down, Bradley, I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. His bewilderment rapidly curdled into defensive fury. He slammed his hands on the table and leaned over, invading my space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he had when we were teenagers. I am not taking orders from you, he sneered, a desperate, ugly smirk twisting his features. I do not care what kind of rent-a-cop costume you managed to buy, Rebecca. You are a high school dropout. You lived in a trailer park. You could not even afford baby formula. You are nothing but a failure who ran away because you were too weak to handle real life. Now get out of this room and fetch me the officer in charge before I add your name to the lawsuit I am filing against this entire department. I held his furious gaze without blinking. I reached into my leather attaché case resting on the floor beside me. I pulled out a massive 500-page bound document wrapped in a red classified cover. I lifted it high and slammed it down onto the center of the steel table. The loud smack echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot, making Bradley physically flinch and step back. Major Thorne, United States Cyber Command. I stated, my voice echoing like shattering ice. And this dropout just traced your Cayman Island shell companies back to stolen body armor funds. Bradley's eyes darted down to the red dossier, his smirk faltering as he read the bold black letters spelling out his name, his company, and the exact routing numbers of his hidden offshore trusts. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together over the report. For 3 years, Bradley, I have tracked every single dirty dollar you moved. I watched you skim millions off the top of defense contracts meant to protect soldiers in active combat zones. I watched you route that blood money through fake charities in Panama. I watched you use the funds meant for Kevlar plates to buy Madison a $2 million penthouse just to buy her love and poison her against me. You are insane, Bradley stammered, taking another step back, his face draining of blood as the reality of his situation began to set in. Those are legitimate business transfers. You cannot prove anything. Page 214 details. The exact wire transfer from your corporate account to the shell company in the Caymans, I recited from memory, never breaking eye contact. Page 300 outlines the kickbacks you paid to foreign officials. You are sloppy, Bradley, arrogant and sloppy. You thought because you threw money at politicians, no one would ever look at the digital footprints you left behind. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. But you forgot that I am the one who built the tracking algorithm they use to hunt financial terrorists. Bradley swallowed hard. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He paced away from the table, desperately trying to construct a lifeline out of his shattered ego. He tugged at his silk collar, pacing the narrow space, forcing a loud, hollow laugh. You think you have me cornered? He scoffed, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are just a bitter, jealous ex-wife abusing her little government badge because she cannot stand seeing me succeed. My lawyer is the best defense attorney in Washington. He bills $1,000 an hour. He is probably walking into the Pentagon lobby right now. I will be out of this concrete box in an hour, Rebecca. And when I get out, I am going home to my beautiful young wife, and I am going to make sure the military strips you of whatever pathetic rank you managed to con your way into. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, trying to project total victory. Vanessa is calling the legal team right now. She has all the emergency protocols. She is loyal, Rebecca. She knows how to protect the empire. I slowly unclasped my hands. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket and pulled out a single glossy surveillance photograph. I placed it face down on the table, then slid it smoothly across the metal surface until it rested right at his fingertips. Your lawyer cannot help you, Bradley, I said softly. And your loyal wife certainly will not. Bradley frowned, his bravado wavering as he looked down at the photograph. He reached out and flipped it over. The image was a high-resolution still taken from a facial recognition security camera at Dulles International Airport. The timestamp in the corner read exactly 45 minutes ago. The photograph clearly showed Vanessa. She was not calling his lawyers. She was sprinting toward an international departure gate, completely abandoning him. But it was not the betrayal that made Bradley's knees buckle. It was what she was carrying. Gripped tightly in Vanessa's manicured hand was a heavy black tactical duffel bag. That is your safe, Bradley, I whispered, watching his entire world collapse into dust. Your wife cleared out the wall safe before the FBI breached the penthouse. She is carrying a duffel bag full of your classified military hard drives straight toward a non-extradition country. Bradley stared at the photograph, his breathing shallow and rapid. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He picked up the glossy paper with trembling fingers, bringing it closer to his eyes, as if a different angle would change reality. Vanessa was wearing a dark trench coat, a silk scarf pulled up over her hair to hide her face. But there was no mistaking the custom black duffel bag she clutched tightly against her chest. "She would not do this," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking as his arrogant facade finally began to splinter. "We had an extraction plan. She was supposed to call Mitchell and wait for the lawyers." "There is no Mitchell, Bradley," I stated calmly, leaning back in my steel chair. "There is no cavalry coming to save you, and your lawyers cannot untangle a federal treason charge in an hour." Vanessa saw the writing on the wall the second my cyber team infiltrated your encrypted servers. She knew the offshore accounts were burning. So she took the only thing of value you had left, your insurance policy. Those hard drives contain enough classified blackmail material on foreign diplomats and corrupt defense contractors to guarantee her a very comfortable life in a country that does not sign extradition treaties with the United States. She sold you out for a boarding pass and a clean escape. He slammed his fist against the table, the metallic echo ringing in the small room. "You set me up. You planted this evidence. You hacked my personal servers to frame me." "I did not have to plant a single thing. I just followed the money." I opened the red dossier and flipped to the center section, turning it so it faced him. I tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against a series of highlighted bank transfers. "Let us talk about the Hope Foundation. Your glorious tax-exempt charity ostensibly designed to provide housing for the families of wounded veterans. You hosted lavish galas for it. You gave tearful speeches on cable news networks about supporting the troops and honoring their sacrifice." Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the heavy steel door as if calculating the impossible odds of an escape. "My team audited the foundation." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "We pulled the digital thread. Over the last 4 years, you funneled $12 million of stolen Department of Defense funds into that charity. But you did not build a single house for a veteran, did you? Instead, the money was washed through the foundation and routed directly into a private real estate trust. A blind trust that ultimately purchased a $2 million penthouse in Northern Virginia. The exact penthouse you gifted to our daughter last month to show her how generous her father is." His jaw tightened. He glared at me, the panic in his eyes slowly hardening into a cornered, vicious malice. "You bought her affection with stolen money," I said, leaning forward so he could see the absolute disgust in my eyes. "You used a charity meant for wounded soldiers to launder your embezzlement, and you put the deed in Madison's name to hide the asset. You turned our 18-year-old daughter into an unwitting accessory to federal wire fraud just to avoid paying taxes on stolen funds. I gave her the life you never could." Bradley spat, leaning across the table, his face inches from mine. "I gave her everything. You left her. You walked away when she was a toddler because you were a pathetic failure who could not afford to put a roof over her head. I built an empire. I showed her what real success looks like while you were scraping by on a government salary. You built a house of cards on the backs of dead soldiers," I countered smoothly. "And tonight the wind blew." Bradley let out a sharp, cruel laugh, a sound born of pure desperation. "It does not matter what you show a judge. It does not matter what files your little cyber team managed to hack. You think this makes you a winner. You think taking me down and seizing my assets will suddenly make Madison love you." He stood up, kicking his chair back. It clattered against the concrete wall, but I did not flinch or break eye contact. "Madison hates you," Bradley growled, pacing the short distance of the interrogation room like a rabid dog. "She will always hate you. I spent 15 years making sure she knew exactly who abandoned her. She thinks you are a joke. She thinks you are a sad, poor, pathetic woman who chose a uniform over her own flesh and blood. When I tell her what you did tonight, when I tell her that you orchestrated this entire raid out of petty, vindictive jealousy, she will spit on your name. You will never get her back. I made sure of that. I won Rebecca." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the venom he hurled at me. Years ago, those words would have shattered me, They would have reduced me to the weeping, broken teenager he remembered, desperate for scraps of validation. But I was no longer that girl. I was a major in the United States Cyber Command, and I had orchestrated this night with absolute flawless precision. "Are you quite finished?" I asked quietly. "You have nothing, Rebecca. You hear me. You are nothing to her." I reached out and placed my hand over a small, inconspicuous black button embedded in the surface of the steel table. I pressed it down firmly. The heavy fluorescent lights overhead instantly dimmed. A low, mechanical hum filled the room. The large mirror mounted on the wall to my right, the one Bradley had been using to check his reflection and fix his tie since he sat down, suddenly shifted. The opaque glass illuminated from the other side, transforming instantly into a clear, massive window. Bradley turned his head, his cruel smile freezing permanently on his face. Standing in the observation corridor, bathed in the harsh light of the adjacent room, was Madison. She was still wearing the expensive silk dress he had bought her, but it was crumpled and stained with tears. She was shaking violently, her hands covering her mouth to muffle the sounds of quiet sobs racking her body. Standing directly behind her with his hands resting supportively on her shoulders was DeAndre. Madison had not just been brought to the Pentagon. She had been standing on the other side of that glass for the last 20 minutes. She had heard every single word. She heard her father confess to laundering money through a fake charity. She heard him admit to buying her penthouse with stolen federal funds. And most devastatingly, she heard him weaponize her love, bragging loudly about how he had spent 15 years manipulating her mind to hate her mother. Bradley's mouth fell open. He stumbled backward, his shoulders hitting the cold concrete wall. "Madison," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Sweetheart, wait. It is not what it looks like. They force me to say those things." Madison did not speak. She simply stared at the man she had idolized her entire life, her eyes filled with a profound, shattering heartbreak. She lowered her hands from her mouth and looked at me. Through the glass, the absolute realization passed between us. The lies were dead. The carefully constructed narrative Bradley had used to keep us apart was completely destroyed. She turned her back to the glass. DeAndre guided her gently away, leading her down the sterile corridor and out of sight. The lights in the observation room snapped off. The glass instantly reverted to a cold, solid mirror reflecting Bradley's horrified, pale face back at him. I stood up, gathering the red dossier and sliding the photograph of Vanessa back into my pocket. I buttoned my dress uniform coat, my movements precise and deliberate. "You were right about one thing, Bradley," I said, walking toward the heavy steel door. "I did leave her 15 years ago, but I spent every single day since then becoming a woman who could protect her from monsters like you." I knocked twice on the steel door. The heavy deadbolt clanked open immediately. "Have a Merry Christmas, Bradley." I stepped out into the hallway, leaving him alone in the windowless concrete box, with nothing but his reflection and the absolute certainty that he had lost everything. The heavy steel door of Interrogation Room 4 clicked shut behind me, sealing Bradley in his self-made tomb. I turned down the sterile, brightly lit corridor and saw Madison. She had broken away from DeAndre and was sprinting blindly toward the exit, her silk designer dress catching around her knees. She did not get far. She collapsed against the concrete wall, her knees buckling as the weight of her father's confession crushed the breath out of her. I closed the distance between us, my combat boots echoing sharply on the linoleum floor. I did not offer empty platitudes or wrap her in a suffocating hug. She had been fed comfortable lies her entire life. I owed her the absolute truth. I crouched down to her eye level, keeping my posture perfectly straight, a grounding force in her collapsing world. "He lied to me," Madison gasped, her hands gripping her hair as she stared at the floor. "My entire life. The penthouse, the cars, the tuition. It is all blood money. He stole from soldiers to buy me things, Mom. He bought me with stolen money." I placed a firm, steady hand on her trembling shoulder. "Yes, Madison," I said, my voice projecting unwavering strength. "He built an empire on fraud and manipulated you to protect his ego. But his crimes do not define who you are. The truth is agonizing right now, but it is the only thing that will set you free from his control. You are going to survive this." She looked up at me. Her mascara ruined her eyes, searching my face for the teenage mother she had been taught to despise. Instead, she found a major in the United States Cyber Command who had just dismantled a federal treason ring. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time she leaned forward, resting her head against my decorated uniform jacket. I held her gently, letting 15 years of forced separation dissolve in the harsh fluorescent light of the Pentagon sublevel. Our quiet moment was violently interrupted. The heavy security doors at the end of the corridor slammed open. Caroline stormed into the secure holding area, her diamond earrings flashing aggressively as she shoved past two bewildered military police officers. Bradley's sister was a hurricane of entitlement, her expensive fur coat flailing behind her as her manicured finger immediately locked onto her husband. DeAndre stood calmly a few feet away from Madison and me, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tailored slacks. DeAndre Caroline shrieked, her shrill voice echoing off the concrete walls. "What is happening? The feds just seized my platinum cards. They locked the accounts. You need to call your partners at the firm right now. Get Bradley out of that room and get my accounts unfrozen. We are family, DeAndre. You owe us. Fix this." DeAndre did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or scramble to appease her demands the way he had been forced to do for the last 5 years of their marriage. He simply opened his leather briefcase, reaching inside with slow, deliberate precision. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it out toward her. "I owe you absolutely nothing, Caroline," DeAndre said, his deep baritone cutting through her hysteria like a blade. "You and your brother think money makes you untouchable. You think loyalty means covering up treason." Caroline stared at the envelope, her face twisting in confusion. "What is that? What are you talking about?" "I have been working as Major Thorne's forensic financial informant for the last 6 months." DeAndre stated, his eyes locking onto hers with cold indifference. "Every blind trust, every shell corporation, every offshore transfer Bradley made. I audited them. I packaged the data, and I handed it directly to Cyber Command. And these," he said, dropping the manila envelope onto the floor at her feet, "are the divorce papers. I signed them this morning." Caroline gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. "You betrayed your own family," she sputtered, her chest heaving with rage. "You are nothing without Bradley. You are nothing without my money." "It was never your money," Caroline, DeAndre countered smoothly, stepping forward to deliver the final crushing blow. "You really thought your little luxury boutique in Georgetown was turning a profit. You thought selling overpriced handbags was funding your trips to Monaco. Bradley has been using your boutique as a front to launder the stolen Department of Defense funds for 3 years." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from her face as the realization hit her. The federal asset freeze did not just hit Bradley's accounts. DeAndre continued, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "It hit yours. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division breached the doors of your storefront exactly 12 minutes ago. They are currently seizing your inventory, your ledgers, and your servers. You are completely broke, Caroline, and you are going to federal prison." Caroline let out a guttural, terrifying wail, dropping to her knees beside the divorce papers, clutching her fur coat as her reality disintegrated around her. I stood up, leaving Madison in DeAndre's protective care, ready to coordinate the FBI task force to track down Vanessa and the missing hard drives. But before I could key my radio, the secondary blast doors at the far end of the corridor hissed open. The heavy, synchronized marching of combat boots echoed through the hallway. Colonel Mitchell, my direct commanding officer, strode into the secure sector. His face was a mask of furious, unyielding authority. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed military police officers, their hands resting menacingly on their holstered weapons. Mitchell stopped 10 feet away from me. The air in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. He did not look at the weeping Caroline or the shattered Madison. His cold, calculating eyes locked entirely onto me. Major Thorne, Colonel Mitchell, barked, his voice echoing with absolute command. You have overstepped your authority for the last time. I squared my shoulders, keeping my posture flawless. Sir, I have just secured a confession for federal treason and embezzlement. The suspect is in interrogation room 4. I am not here for Bradley Hayes, Mitchell said, taking a threatening step forward. I am here for you. You initiated an unauthorized raid on a civilian contractor. You utilized classified cyber assets without my direct written approval. Stand down immediately, Major. You are officially relieved of your command. Hand over the forensic case files and give me the encrypted tracking data for the missing hard drives right now, or I will have you arrested for insubordination and treason. I stared at Colonel Mitchell. The harsh fluorescent lights cast deep shadows across his face, highlighting the rigid tension in his jaw. The aggression in his posture was not the standard bureaucratic anger of a superior officer bypassed in the chain of command. It was something far more primal. It was panic. Pure, unadulterated panic. With all due respect, Colonel, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. This is an active federal financial investigation. The evidence secured in this dossier validates a massive breach of national security. I looked at his outstretched hand. I looked at the slight tremor in his fingers. Then the pieces of the puzzle that had bothered me for 6 months suddenly snapped into terrifying clarity. How did he know to come down here? The raid on Bradley had been executed in absolute silence. Only my trusted unit knew the target. But Mitchell had just stormed into the sublevel, demanding the encrypted tracking data for the missing hard drives. I had not told anyone outside this hallway about Vanessa fleeing with the drives. The only way Mitchell could possibly know about the safe, the drives, and Vanessa's escape was if he was part of the contingency plan. My mind raced through the forensic ledgers DeAndre had provided. We had traced the stolen Department of Defense funds through Panama and into the Cayman Islands. Most of the money funded Bradley's lavish lifestyle. But there was one account heavily encrypted and buried behind layers of corporate proxies, receiving steady monthly deposits of $50,000. Account 884-Bravo. We had not been able to unmask the beneficiary until this exact moment. You are account 884, Bravo, I stated, the realization dropping the temperature in the corridor to freezing. Mitchell's eyes darted toward the MPs for a fraction of a second before snapping back to me. His expression hardened into a dangerous mask. I do not know what you are talking about, Thorne. Give me the files. Bradley was not just skimming off the top of defense contracts. I continued, my voice gaining volume and absolute certainty. He was paying for guaranteed approvals. He needed someone high up in the Pentagon Acquisitions Command to push his substandard body armor contracts through the vetting process. He needed a mole to blind the oversight committees. He was paying you, Colonel. You bought your vacation home in Aspen with the blood of soldiers who died wearing defective plates. Shut your mouth, Major Mitchell roared, stepping directly into my personal space. You are speaking treason against a commanding officer. You sold your country for offshore deposits, I shot back, refusing to yield a single inch. You are the one who alerted Bradley's extraction team when the raid began. You are the one who told Vanessa to run. You need those hard drives just as much as Bradley does, because the second the FBI cracks them, your name is on the top of the indictment list. Mitchell's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. He turned to the lead military police officer. Seize her attaché case, confiscate her tactical tablet, and arrest her. The two MPs stepped forward, their faces tight with conflict, but bound by duty to obey a direct order from a colonel. Before the closest officer could lay a hand on my leather case, I reached down and gripped the handle of my tactical tablet, resting on top of it. I pressed my thumb firmly against the biometric scanner embedded in the casing. A rapid sequence of red lights flashed across the edge of the screen, immediately followed by a solid, bright green confirmation light. A sharp electronic chirp echoed in the hallway. "Stop," Mitchell yelled, lunging forward. "What did you just do?" I stepped back smoothly, holding the tablet up so he could see the locked red screen displaying a bioencryption warning. "Protocol Omega is now active." I announced, my voice ringing with total authority. "The local files on this device are wiped. The master files on the Cyber Command servers are now locked behind a biometric firewall. They require my specific heartbeat rhythm, my retinal scan, and a rolling dual-factor passcode to decrypt." Mitchell stared at the red screen, his breathing ragged. "Reverse it," he commanded, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "I cannot," I replied coolly. "That is the beauty of the protocol. If you try to force access, if you try to hack the server, or if I do not input the secondary countercode within 12 hours, the system automatically self-destructs the origin files. But before it wipes them, it executes a dead man switch. It will broadcast the raw, unredacted financial data to the Department of Justice, the Inspector General, and every major investigative news outlet in Washington. You have signed your own death warrant." Rebecca Mitchell sneered, dropping the formalities of rank. "You think you are a hero. You think you are saving the military. You are a naive fool who does not understand how this city works. The military-industrial complex requires lubrication. Bradley provided a service. We got the gear we needed and everyone got paid. You are going to burn for this." "I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic," I said, staring directly into his corrupt, panicked eyes. "Today, Colonel, you are the domestic enemy." Mitchell turned to the military police officers, his face twisted in absolute fury. "Major Thorne's security clearance is revoked effective immediately. Strip her of her badge, her credentials, and her sidearm. Escort her out of this sublevel and throw her off the installation. If she sets foot on Pentagon grounds again, you have my direct authorization to shoot her on sight." The lead MP stepped forward, looking deeply apologetic. "Major, I need your badge and your weapon." I did not resist. I unclipped my Pentagon security badge from my lapel and handed it over. I unholstered my service weapon, cleared the chamber with practiced precision, and handed it to the officer grip first. I left the locked tablet and the red dossier on the floor at Mitchell's feet. They were useless to him now. They were nothing but a ticking time bomb. I straightened my jacket and looked at Mitchell one last time. "You can escort me out, Colonel. But you cannot stop the clock. You have 12 hours before your entire life goes up in flames." The two military police officers fell into step on either side of me, their expressions a mix of duty and discomfort. I marched down the polished corridors of the Pentagon, for what might be the last time, the absence of my sidearm leaving a strange hollow weight at my hip. I did not look back at Mitchell. I had left him with a choice, and the ticking clock of Protocol Omega was already echoing in my mind. 12 hours until the dead man switch activated. 12 hours to tear down a corrupt empire from the outside. We reached the heavy glass exit doors of the sublevel checkpoint. The lead MP stepped ahead, pushing the door open against the howling wind. "Stay off federal property, Major," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of the usual sharp military cadence. "Good luck out there." I stepped through the threshold, and the heavy doors sealed behind me with a definitive click. The biting cold of the Virginia winter hit me instantly. Snow was falling in thick, swirling sheets, coating the massive expanse of the Pentagon parking lot in a layer of blinding white. I stood alone on the pavement, a civilian for the first time in 15 years. Technically, I was facing a court-martial federal treason charges and a lifetime in Leavenworth if Mitchell managed to control the narrative. I had no badge, no weapon, and no official authority. But as the freezing wind whipped against my dress uniform, I felt an intense, overwhelming clarity. I was no longer bound by the chain of command that protected cowards like Bradley and traitors like Mitchell. Headlights flared to life through the blinding snow. A sleek black SUV pulled out of a visitor space and rolled smoothly toward the curb, its tires crunching over the fresh accumulation. The passenger door popped open before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. "Get in," DeAndre commanded from the driver's seat. I climbed into the heated cabin, slamming the door against the howling wind. The sudden warmth was a sharp contrast to the freezing reality outside. I turned around and looked into the back seat. Madison was huddled in the corner, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket DeAndre must have kept in the trunk. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and swollen, but the hostile defensive teenager who had sneered at me hours earlier was gone. In her place was a terrified young woman whose entire reality had just been violently deconstructed. I held her gaze for a long moment. I did not try to force a conversation or demand a tearful reconciliation. She had just watched her father burn his own legacy to the ground. She needed stability, not pressure. I gave her a firm, reassuring nod. She nodded back, pulling the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders. It was a small gesture, but it was the most genuine connection we had shared in a decade. Mitchell pulled my clearance, I said, turning back to face the windshield. He is the mole. He is account 884-Bravo. He tipped Vanessa off and gave her the window to run with the classified hard drives. I locked the cyber command servers behind a biometric firewall, but he has the entire installation locked down. If we push this through official channels, he will bury the evidence, classify the investigation, and have me arrested for treason before sunrise. DeAndre shifted the SUV into gear, pulling away from the curb and navigating through the snowy labyrinth of the parking lot. Mitchell has jurisdiction over military assets, DeAndre said, his eyes scanning the dark road ahead. He can stall the FBI raid on Bradley's corporate offices by claiming national security interference. He can block the warrants. You are a civilian now, Rebecca. If Mitchell intercepts Vanessa and gets his hands on those hard drives, he destroys the only physical proof of his involvement. Bradley walks, Mitchell keeps his stars, and you go to federal prison. I am not letting Mitchell bury the truth, I stated, staring at the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. We have 12 hours before my dead man switch dumps the financial ledgers to the press. We need to find Vanessa and secure those drives ourselves. Without military resources, without satellite tracking, without a tactical team. We do not need a tactical team, DeAndre replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. We just need to follow the breadcrumbs Bradley was stupid enough to leave behind. DeAndre reached into the center console, opening a hidden compartment. He pulled out a thick, ruggedized burner laptop and dropped it onto my lap. While you were playing nice with the colonel and getting yourself stripped of your rank, I was busy, DeAndre said, tapping the steering wheel. When the IRS agents raided Caroline's boutique, I used my forensic clearance to clone the data dump from their servers. But more importantly, before the feds breached the penthouse, I managed to clone the backup data from Vanessa's seized secondary phone, the one she left behind in her rush to the airport. I opened the heavy lid of the burner laptop. The screen glowed to life, displaying lines of decrypted financial routing data. You tracked her extraction route, I asked, my fingers already flying across the keyboard to analyze the data packets. I did better than that, DeAndre said, taking a sharp turn onto the highway leading toward Dulles. Vanessa did not just steal money. She took the hard drives because she realized what Bradley was actually doing. Bradley did not just set up offshore shell companies to hide his embezzlement. He set up a failsafe, a scapegoat to take the fall if the federal government ever audited the Department of Defense contracts. What kind of failsafe? I asked, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted Cayman Island banking structures displayed on the screen. Look at the primary signatory on the master trust, DeAndre instructed, his voice dropping to a grim, heavy tone. Look at who actually owns the Panama shell companies and the real estate holdings. I scrolled down to the foundational documents of the Hope Foundation and the offshore accounts. The biometric signatures and digital authorization codes were not registered to Bradley. They were not registered to Vanessa. My blood turned to ice. I slowly turned around to look at the back seat. Madison was staring out the window at the falling snow, completely oblivious to the digital execution warrant glowing on the screen. Bradley did not just buy his daughter a penthouse to buy her love, DeAndre said, the anger finally bleeding into his composed demeanor. He registered the entire illegal enterprise under her identity. The stolen blood money, the defense fraud, the tax evasion. It is all in her name. I stared at the screen, the horrific reality of Bradley's ultimate betrayal sinking in. If the FBI followed the money without the context on those missing hard drives, Bradley would claim ignorance. He would claim his daughter managed the trust. He had framed his own 18-year-old child to protect himself. If Mitchell buried the evidence and the federal hammer came down, Madison would go to prison as the kingpin of a $12 million treason scheme. I stared at the glowing screen of the burner laptop, my mind racing as the horrific reality of the digital architecture settled in. The corporate proxy documents, the offshore holding companies, the encrypted bank routing numbers. Everything was cleanly and legally tied to Madison Hayes. Bradley had executed the ultimate betrayal. He had not simply bought his daughter's affection with stolen wealth, he had weaponized her very identity to build his impenetrable firewall. I turned around in the passenger seat. Madison was tracing aimless patterns on the fogged glass of the SUV window. She looked small, entirely stripped of the arrogant armor she had worn for years. She was just a teenager whose entire universe had been violently deconstructed in the span of an hour. "Madison," I said, keeping my voice painfully steady. "I need you to look at me." She blinked heavily, pulling her vacant gaze away from the blinding snowstorm outside. Her eyes were bloodshot and hollow. "I know he is a criminal, Mom," she whispered. The words slipped out naturally, a desperate reversion to childhood instinct. "You do not have to keep proving it to me. I heard him in that room. I heard what he said about you. I know it is all blood money." "It is much worse than that," I replied. I lifted the heavy burner laptop and rested it on the center console so the screen directly faced the back seat. "Bradley did not just lie to you. He used you as a human shield. Look at these documents." Madison leaned forward, squinting at the dense legal jargon and the complex banking codes illuminating the dark cabin. "I do not understand what I am looking at," she said, her brow furrowing in confusion. "These are the offshore accounts, the ones he used to steal from the military." "Yes," DeAndre interjected from the driver's seat, keeping his eyes locked on the treacherous, icy road ahead. "But look closely at the primary signatory. Look at the registered owner of the Hope Foundation and the Cayman Island Trusts." Madison read the highlighted text on the screen. Her breath hitched audibly. "That is my name," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the display. "Why is my legal name on this? I never signed anything like this." "He had you sign mountains of paperwork when you turned 18 last month, did he not?" I asked, piecing the timeline together. "Stacks of corporate documents he probably told you were just trust fund formalities." Madison nodded rapidly, the panic beginning to rise in her throat. "He told me I was officially joining the board of his company. He said it was just standard tax documents to secure my future inheritance. I trusted him. I signed exactly where he pointed. He forged your biometric signatures onto the foundational documents using those agreements," I explained, feeling a cold, lethal fury radiating through my veins. "He made you the sole beneficiary and the legal director of the entire embezzlement ring." Bradley knew the Department of Defense would eventually audit the body armor contracts. He knew federal investigators would eventually follow the money, so he built a failsafe. He built a firewall out of his own flesh and blood. Madison shook her head violently, her hands coming up to grip the edges of the wool blanket. "No, he would not do that. He loves me. He told me I was his entire world. He spent my whole life protecting me from you." "He loves his own survival, Madison," I stated bluntly, refusing to sugarcoat the absolute horror of her reality. "If Colonel Mitchell successfully buries my internal investigation tonight, the Department of Justice will eventually take over this case blindly. When the FBI audits these specific files, they will see your signature. They will not see a manipulated teenager. They will see the legal mastermind of a $12 million fraud scheme." "What does that mean?" Madison choked out, her chest beginning to heave uncontrollably. "It means tax evasion," DeAndre said quietly, his voice heavy with grim certainty. "It means federal wire fraud, conspiracy, and treason. It means 20 years in a maximum security federal prison." The words struck Madison like physical blows. A sharp, ragged gasp tore from her throat. She dropped the heavy wool blanket, her hands flying to her chest. She could not breathe. A full-blown panic attack seized her entire body. She collapsed back against the leather seat, gasping for air, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "He set me up," she wailed, her voice cracking as the devastating betrayal crushed her. "My own father set me up to take the fall. I am going to jail. My life is over." "Breathe, Madison," I commanded, unbuckling my seatbelt and reaching into the back to grab her shaking hands. "Look at me. Follow my breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. We are going to fix this." She shook her head frantically, pulling her hands away from my grip. She clawed at her own neck, feeling as though the very air inside the SUV was suffocating her. Her manicured fingers caught on a thick silver chain hidden beneath the silk collar of her designer dress. She yanked it forward. A heavy, intricate diamond locket tumbled out, catching the ambient amber light of the street lamps passing by outside. Madison froze. Her frantic, ragged breathing suddenly stopped. She stared down at the glittering jewelry resting against her trembling palm. A strange, haunting clarity washed over her tear-stained face. "My sweet 16." Madison whispered, her voice dropping to a trembling murmur. "What about it?" I asked, watching her intently. "He gave this to me for my 16th birthday," she said, her fingers tracing the diamond-encrusted surface of the heavy pendant. "It was a massive party at the country club, but he pulled me aside into his private study before any of the guests arrived. He locked the heavy oak doors. He put this chain around my neck himself. He told me it was a priceless family heirloom. He said it was the most important thing he would ever give me." Madison looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "He made me swear to never take it off. He said if I ever found myself in absolute danger, if everything in our lives fell apart, this locket would save me. I thought he was just being dramatic. I thought it was just a rich father being sentimental." "Give it to me," I ordered, extending my hand. Madison unclasped the silver chain and dropped the heavy pendant into my palm. I turned it over under the dim overhead cabin light. It was custom-milled, significantly heavier than standard platinum jewelry. I ran my thumbnail along the smooth, metallic edge, finding a microscopic, nearly invisible seam hidden beneath the decorative floral filigree. "DeAndre, hand me your pocket knife," I said. DeAndre retrieved a small, flat tactical blade from his belt and passed it over without taking his eyes off the snowy road. I wedged the razor-thin steel tip directly into the hidden seam of the locket and applied sharp, twisting pressure. A loud metallic snap echoed in the quiet cabin. The entire back panel of the locket popped open. It was not a locket at all. There was no photograph inside. Nestled perfectly into a custom-molded shockproof foam insert was a tiny black micro SD card. I held the tiny piece of black plastic up to the dim cabin light, the weight of its implications settling over the cramped SUV. DeAndre did not waste another second. He threw the vehicle into drive, and we sped off into the blinding Virginia snowstorm, leaving the imposing structure of the Pentagon far behind us. 30 minutes later, we pulled into the cracked, ice-covered parking lot of the Starlight Motor Inn. It was a decaying relic off Interstate 66, boasting flickering neon and water-stained walls. For Madison, who had spent her entire life wrapped in penthouse luxury and high thread count ignorance, stepping into room 114 was a brutal shock to the system. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and cheap bleach. A single lamp illuminated the peeling floral wallpaper, casting sickly yellow shadows across the cramped space. She sat rigidly on the edge of the sagging mattress, pulling her designer coat tightly around her trembling shoulders, her eyes fixed entirely on the burner laptop DeAndre was setting up on a wobbly veneer desk. I pulled the heavy blackout curtains shut, ensuring not a single sliver of light escaped into the parking lot. DeAndre slotted the micro SD card into a specialized encrypted reader, connecting it to the ruggedized laptop. The screen immediately flashed a command prompt demanding a decryption key. "He did not tell me a password," Madison whispered, her voice barely carrying over the loud mechanical rattle of the motel heater. "He just said it would save me." "He did not need to give you a password," DeAndre said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Bradley is an egomaniac who believes he is the smartest man in any room. He tied the offshore trusts to your biometric data, but this is a localized analog backup. He would use something he deemed untouchable, something he believed no one else would ever figure out." DeAndre typed rapidly, inputting a complex string of characters. The prompt flashed a harsh red. "Access denied." "What did you try?" I asked, stepping behind his shoulder to watch the screen. "His offshore account routing prefix." DeAndre replied, cracking his knuckles. "I am running a brute force decryption protocol, but if this card has a self-wipe mechanism tied to failed attempts, we only have a few shots before it permanently formats itself." "Try her mother's maiden name," I suggested, keeping my eyes on the blinking cursor. DeAndre typed it in. The screen flashed red again. "Access denied." Madison stood up, walking slowly toward the desk. Her eyes were fixed on the screen with an eerie, detached calm. Try the coordinates of his first defense contract, she instructed. He has them framed in solid gold in his study. He told me it was the exact day his real life began. DeAndre keyed in the geographic coordinates. The screen froze for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the red prompt vanished, replaced by a massive, sprawling directory of files opening across the display. Access granted. We were looking at the holy grail of federal corruption. Bradley had not just documented his own crimes. He had documented the entire ecosystem of treason he had built within the United States military. I opened the master ledger, and the sheer scale of the betrayal took my breath away. Row after row of names, ranks, offshore routing numbers, and exact payment dates filled the screen. This is his insurance policy, I stated, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach as I recognized names extending far beyond the Cyber Command sublevel. If the Department of Justice ever breached his firewall and tried to pin the blame on Madison, he could use this ledger to blackmail half the Pentagon into shutting the investigation down. He mapped out every single bribe. Look at this, DeAndre said, pointing to a highlighted row near the top of the hierarchy. Colonel Mitchell, account 884-Bravo. The ledger detailed exactly how much Mitchell had been paid over the last 3 years. But it went deeper. Attached to his file were audio recordings, encrypted emails, and procurement approvals bearing Mitchell's digital signature. Mitchell had authorized the deployment of substandard body armor to active combat zones, knowingly endangering American soldiers, all in exchange for a continuous stream of untraceable cash deposited into a Cayman Islands account. Madison stared at the screen, reading the names and the staggering dollar amounts. The last shred of her childhood innocence evaporated in the stale air of the motel room. He really did it, she said, the realization settling heavily into her bones. He sold out his country, he sold out his family, he sold me. You are the only reason we have the leverage to stop him, Madison, I said, turning to face her directly. We are going to transmit this entire data dump directly to the Inspector General and the highest levels of the Department of Justice. Mitchell will not be able to bury this once it hits the secure servers. DeAndre initiated a secure transfer protocol, preparing to upload the unredacted files through an encrypted proxy network. As the progress bar appeared on the screen, a sudden sharp warning tone erupted from the laptop speakers. A flashing red icon hijacked the center of the display, overriding the transfer window. What is that? I demanded, stepping forward. DeAndre's hands flew across the keyboard, his eyes wide with sudden alarm. It is a silent beacon. Bradley embedded a tracking script into the master ledger. The moment the file was decrypted outside of an authorized IP address, it sent a ping to a secondary server. Can you kill the connection? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs as my tactical instincts flared to life. I just did, DeAndre replied, slamming the laptop shut and pulling the connection cord. But it is too late. The ping carried our exact geolocation. Mitchell has the server access. He knows exactly where we are. We need to move right now. I ordered, grabbing my coat. I turned toward the door, my adrenaline spiking, calculating the fastest extraction route out of the parking lot. Before my hand could reach the brass knob, the harsh hum of the motel heater died completely. The single lamp on the bedside table flickered and went out. Total darkness swallowed the room. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the howling wind outside battering against the thin glass. DeAndre reached out in the pitch black, pulling Madison away from the window and shoving her down behind the heavy wooden desk. Get down and do not move, he hissed, his voice carrying absolute authority. I pressed my back against the icy wall next to the window, peering carefully through the tiny gap where the cheap curtains met. The parking lot street lamps had been killed. The neon sign was dead. But the snow-covered ground was not completely dark. 3 distinct bright red laser sights cut through the swirling snow, sweeping slowly and methodically across our motel room window. Mitchell had not called the local police. He had not notified the FBI or dispatched a standard military police unit to apprehend us. The precision of the lasers, the complete blackout of the sector, and the absolute silence of their approach meant only one thing. Colonel Mitchell had sent a private Black Ops mercenary retrieval team to secure the hard drive and permanently silence anyone who had seen the ledger. The red beams tracked in erratic, overlapping arcs across the thin fabric of the motel curtains. They moved with the cold mechanical precision of a professional hit squad sweeping a target zone. I pressed my spine flat against the freezing drywall, calculating our impossible odds. I had no badge, no body armor, and no sidearm. DeAndre crouched low behind the heavy wooden desk, shielding Madison with his entire body. He did not panic. He did not hesitate. He moved with a lethal fluidity that betrayed years of Tier 1 military combat experience, a past he kept buried beneath his tailored suits and forensic ledgers. He reached beneath his tailored jacket and drew a suppressed Glock 19 from a concealed shoulder holster, racking the slide with a sharp metallic click that cut through the silence of the dark room. He locked eyes with me across the shadows. He held up 3 fingers pointing toward the front window, then jerked his chin toward the bathroom door at the rear of the unit. I nodded, understanding the tactical play immediately. We needed a diversion to draw their fire to the front, giving us exactly 3 seconds to breach the rear perimeter. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling silently over the damp carpet toward the mini-fridge resting on a low wooden stand. I yanked the heavy microwave off the top, wrapping the thick power cord around my wrist to secure a grip. I looked back at DeAndre. He raised his hand, dropping his fingers one by one. 3, 2, 1. I hurled the heavy microwave directly through the center of the front window. The glass shattered outward in a chaotic explosion of sound. Instantly, the parking lot erupted. Suppressed automatic weapons shredded the front of the motel room, tearing through the drywall, pulverizing the television, and ripping the cheap mattress to shreds. The air filled with the choking dust of pulverized plaster and the sharp stench of cordite. While the mercenaries poured sustained fire into the front of the room, DeAndre kicked the bathroom door open. He grabbed Madison by the collar of her designer coat, hauling her off the floor and shoving her into the cramped, tiled space. I followed a split second later, gripping the burner laptop and the micro SD card tightly against my chest. DeAndre did not bother with the window latch. He drove the steel butt of his Glock directly into the frosted glass, shattering the pane and sweeping the jagged edges away with his forearm. The howling Virginia blizzard ripped through the opening, bringing a blast of sub-zero wind that stole the breath from my lungs. "Go!" DeAndre barked, hoisting Madison up by her waist and pushing her roughly through the broken window frame. She tumbled out into the freezing darkness with a muffled cry. I vaulted through the opening right behind her, landing hard in the knee-deep snow of the back alley. DeAndre followed instantly, his boots hitting the frozen pavement just as the mercenaries kicked down the front door of our motel room. "Keep your head down and stay entirely in my shadow," I ordered Madison, gripping her arm and pulling her up. The alley behind the motel was a narrow, treacherous corridor of overflowing dumpsters and rusted air conditioning units completely blanketed in blinding white snow. We moved fast, using the heavy metal dumpsters as cover. DeAndre took the point position. His weapon raised, his eyes scanning the dark rooftops and the narrow gaps between the buildings. A shadow shifted at the far end of the alley. One of the mercenaries had flanked the building to cut off our escape route. He was heavily armored, raising a suppressed carbine equipped with a thermal optic sight. DeAndre did not give the man a chance to acquire a target lock. He sprinted forward, his footfalls completely silenced by the deep snow. He closed the distance with terrifying speed, ducking beneath the trajectory of the rifle barrel. DeAndre drove his left forearm into the mercenary's throat, slamming him violently against the brick wall. With his right hand, he stripped the carbine from the man's grip, reversed the weapon, and drove the heavy stock into the side of the mercenary's tactical helmet. The man went limp, collapsing into the snow without a sound. DeAndre scooped up the dropped rifle and tossed it to me. I caught the heavy weapon, my fingers immediately finding the familiar placement of the safety selector and the trigger guard. The cold metallic weight of the carbine instantly grounded me. "Now we are an even match," DeAndre whispered, checking the corner of the brick building. "The main road is blocked. Mitchell has 2 SUVs parked across the exit ramp. We need a vehicle, and we need it right now." I scanned the adjacent property. Beyond a rusted chain-link fence sat a rundown commercial bakery. Idling near the loading dock, billowing thick white exhaust into the freezing night air, was a heavy-duty delivery van. The driver was nowhere in sight, likely taking shelter inside from the blinding storm. Over the fence, I commanded. DeAndre grabbed Madison, practically throwing her over the rusted metal links before vaulting over himself. I provided rear cover, keeping the carbine trained on the dark alley behind us as I scaled the fence. We sprinted across the loading bay. DeAndre ripped the driver's side door open, finding the keys dangling in the ignition. He shoved Madison into the cramped middle seat and jumped behind the wheel, while I climbed into the passenger side, rolling the heavy window down to establish a firing line. DeAndre slammed the van into gear, stomping on the accelerator. The heavy tires spun wildly on the ice before catching traction, launching the massive vehicle forward. The roar of the diesel engine echoed through the quiet industrial park, drawing immediate attention. Two mercenaries stepped out from the shadows of the motel parking lot, raising their weapons toward our windshield. I leaned out the passenger window, shouldering the stolen carbine, and unleashed a sustained burst of suppressive fire. The rounds shattered the concrete at their feet, forcing both heavily armed men to dive behind a concrete retaining wall for cover. DeAndre did not slow down. He gripped the steering wheel, aiming the heavy steel grille of the delivery van directly at the chain-link perimeter gate. "Brace yourselves," he shouted over the roar of the engine. We smashed through the locked gate in a violent explosion of twisting metal and snapping chains. The van fishtailed wildly across the snow-covered pavement, but DeAndre wrestled the steering wheel back into alignment, merging recklessly onto the dark, slick surface of the interstate. We accelerated into the blinding storm, putting distance between us and Mitchell's execution squad. Madison was hyperventilating in the middle seat, her hands clamped over her ears, tears streaming down her pale, terrified face. We were alive, but we were entirely off the grid. We had no military backing, no federal protection, and no safe harbor. We possessed the digital keys to destroy the most corrupt cabal in the history of the Pentagon, but we were isolated targets. DeAndre reached forward and slammed his hand against the dashboard radio console, searching for a local weather broadcast to track the severity of the blizzard. The radio crackled to life, filling the cabin with static, before locking onto a clear news frequency. But it was not a weather report. The tense, urgent voice of a national news anchor echoed through the speakers of the stolen van. "We are interrupting our scheduled programming to bring you a breaking national security alert, direct from the Department of Defense," the anchor announced. "A nationwide manhunt is currently underway for Major Rebecca Thorne, a high-ranking officer within United States Cyber Command. Federal warrants have just been issued for her immediate arrest. Major Thorne is considered armed and highly dangerous." Madison lowered her hands from her ears, staring at the radio in absolute shock. The anchor continued, the words dropping like heavy stones into the freezing cabin. "The Department of Justice has charged Major Thorne with federal treason, the theft of highly classified military intelligence assets, and the armed kidnapping of 18-year-old civilian Madison Hayes. Anyone with information regarding her whereabouts is instructed to contact the FBI immediately." The radio broadcast faded into static as DeAndre steered the stolen delivery van deeper into the blinding Virginia snowstorm. The weight of my new fugitive status settled over us like a heavy lead shroud. We were hunted, freezing, and rapidly running out of time. But while we were fighting for our lives in the dark back alleys, the gears of corruption were already turning rapidly in Washington. Colonel Mitchell had not wasted a single second. Within 2 hours of my unauthorized raid, the systemic rot I had tried to expose actively moved to protect its own. Bradley Hayes did not spend the night shivering in a holding cell. He walked out of the federal courthouse in Alexandria through a private underground exit, his tailored suit completely unwrinkled. Mitchell had pulled the necessary strings, leveraging a corrupted federal judge to grant an emergency closed-door bail hearing. Bradley was free, and he was furious. He needed to secure his remaining assets before the FBI could fully untangle the massive web I had dropped in their laps. Bradley bypassed the bright federal seizure notices taped firmly across the mahogany double doors of his Georgetown penthouse. The federal agents had tossed the place, leaving velvet-lined drawers yanked open and expensive artwork askew. Bradley did not care about the physical mess. He marched straight toward his private study, his heavy boots crunching over shattered glass from a broken display case. He stopped dead in the doorway. Vanessa was frantically tearing through the hidden wall safe behind his desk. She had not fled the country as instructed. She was stuffing banded stacks of emergency cash and bearer bonds into a leather duffel bag. "You are supposed to be on a private charter to Zurich," Bradley stated, his voice a low, lethal hum that caused Vanessa to violently flinch. She spun around, dropping a thick stack of $100 bills. She did not look like the composed, arrogant assistant who had sneered at me hours earlier. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess, her designer blouse wrinkled, and her eyes were wide with frantic, cornered panic. "The charter was grounded," Vanessa shouted, backing away from the open safe. "The feds froze the flight manifest. Thorne flagged my passport. I could not get out, Bradley. They were waiting for me at the tarmac." Bradley stepped into the study, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "So instead of following the contingency protocol, you came back here to steal my emergency reserves. You are a parasite, Vanessa." "I am surviving," Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill and desperate, echoing off the high ceilings. "You promised me protection. You promised me immunity if things went sideways. But the FBI raided my apartment an hour ago. They know about the Cayman accounts. They know about Mitchell." Bradley did not flinch. "They know what Thorne told them. They have no physical proof without the hard drives. Where are they?" Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, clutching her arms around her chest. "I do not have them. I dumped them." Bradley closed the distance between them in two massive strides. He grabbed her by the collar of her silk blouse and slammed her violently against the wood-paneled wall. "You did what?" "I made a deal," Vanessa gasped, staring defiantly into his furious, calculating eyes. "I contacted the FBI field office from a burner phone. I offered them the hard drives in exchange for absolute federal immunity. I cut a plea deal, Bradley. I gave them everything. The supply chain fraud, the shell companies, the bribes to Mitchell. I am walking away clean, and you are going to rot in Leavenworth." Bradley stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then slowly, the rage drained entirely from his face. He released her collar, stepping back and smoothing his own jacket with calculated precision. He began to laugh. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed terribly in the ransacked study. "You really think you are the smartest person in the room?" Bradley said, shaking his head with genuine amusement. "You think the FBI will honor a plea deal with a woman who has zero leverage?" "I have the offshore routing numbers," Vanessa countered, rubbing her collarbone, a flicker of uncertainty finally crossing her face. "I have the access codes to the liquid funds." "You have nothing," Bradley stated. He walked over to the desk and casually picked up the discarded duffel bag full of cash. "You are a useful distraction, Vanessa, a convenient proxy. But I never gave you the master access. Did you really think I would leave $70 million in liquid offshore funds sitting in accounts you could independently access?" Vanessa's face went completely pale. All the color drained from her cheeks. "What did you do?" "I triggered the fail-safe the moment I walked out of that courthouse," Bradley said smoothly, zipping the duffel bag closed. "I transferred every single cent out of the Cayman and Panama accounts. I moved it into a decentralized shadow trust. Your access codes are dead. Your routing numbers lead to empty shell companies. You have absolutely nothing to offer the FBI. You are entirely useless to them, and they are going to arrest you the second you walk out of this building." Vanessa collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the hardwood floor, as the absolute certainty of her ruin crushed the breath from her lungs. Bradley ignored her weeping. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, encrypted satellite phone provided by Mitchell. He dialed a sequence of numbers bypassing standard cellular towers and waited for the connection to establish a secure link. In the freezing stolen delivery van miles away, DeAndre's burner laptop suddenly shrieked with an incoming audio request. It was forcing a connection through our encrypted proxy network. DeAndre hit the accept button. Bradley's voice filled the dark cabin of the van, smooth, arrogant, and terrifyingly calm. "I have the money," Rebecca, he stated, not bothering with an introduction. "I have the liquid assets, I have the military backing, and thanks to Colonel Mitchell, I have the federal judge handling the warrants. You have a shiny piece of plastic and a stolen van." I gripped the micro SD card tightly in my palm, my jaw locked so hard my teeth ached. "You are out of plays," Rebecca Bradley continued. his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are a wanted federal fugitive, so here are my terms. Bring me the locket, bring me the ledger. Do it before sunrise, or I trigger the final indictment and Madison spends her entire 20s in a federal penitentiary." "You do not negotiate with terrorists," I stated, my voice slicing through the freezing air of the stolen delivery van with absolute icy certainty. "And that is exactly what you are, Bradley. A domestic terrorist holding your own daughter hostage to cover up your treason." I did not wait for his arrogant rebuttal. I reached forward, grabbed the thick plastic casing of the encrypted satellite phone DeAndre had hijacked to intercept the incoming audio, and smashed my thumb against the disconnect button. The digital connection severed instantly. The cabin plunged back into the rhythmic, deafening hum of the diesel engine and the howling Virginia blizzard battering the windshield. DeAndre kept his eyes locked on the treacherous, snow-slicked interstate, his jaw tight. He has the judge, he has the money, and now he has the FBI officially hunting us down on federal kidnapping charges. We are entirely cornered. "If we hand over the ledger, he kills us anyway," I replied flatly, analyzing the tactical reality of our situation. "He destroys the physical evidence, permanently locks the offshore accounts, pins the embezzlement directly on Madison, and walks away a billionaire patriot. Bradley never leaves loose ends. Surrendering is just a delayed execution." Madison sat trembling in the cramped middle seat. The crushing weight of her father's betrayal had finally stripped away her lifelong denial. She wrapped her arms around her chest, her breath misting in the frigid air. "He is going to send me to prison," she whispered, her voice cracking under the sheer horror of the realization. "He built this entire trap so I would take the fall for his crimes. We have to go to the police. We have to show them the files right now. The police cannot help us," DeAndre said, his tone grim but brutally pragmatic. "The moment we walk into a federal building, we are detained. The ledger gets confiscated as classified material. Colonel Mitchell uses his high-level security clearance to bury it in a Department of Defense black site vault. Then Bradley's purchased judge signs off on your federal indictment. The justice system is functioning exactly as they designed it to. They control the board." I looked down at the tiny black micro SD card resting in my palm. It contained enough explosive truth to dismantle the highest echelons of military corruption, but only if the right people saw it before Mitchell could intercept it. "We cannot fight a covert war against men who own the shadows," I said, my military tactical training overriding the panic attempting to take root in my chest. "If we try to leak this online, Mitchell's cyber division will scrub it from the internet in 30 seconds and trace our exact location. If we try to arrange a handoff with an investigative journalist, Mitchell's mercenaries will intercept the meeting and kill the reporter. We cannot play their game." "So what is the play, Major?" DeAndre asked, downshifting the heavy delivery van and merging onto a darker, less monitored secondary highway, heading toward the District of Columbia. "We pull them into the light," I declared. "We need a stage so bright, so public, and so heavily monitored that Mitchell cannot order his mercenaries to shoot us and Bradley cannot spin his lies. We need to force a spectacle that cannot be classified, redacted, or swept under the rug by corrupt judges." DeAndre nodded slowly, a fierce, calculating energy settling over his features. He reached over with his right hand and flipped open his ruggedized laptop, balancing it precariously on the center console. He typed a rapid sequence of commands with one hand, while steering the heavy van through the snow with the other, accessing a secure, decentralized intelligence cache. "If you want a spotlight," DeAndre said, his eyes scanning the green text scrolling rapidly across his screen, "I have the perfect venue. But it is a literal fortress." "Show me," I commanded. "Tomorrow night. The National Building Museum in Washington." DeAndre explained, pulling up a highly detailed architectural security schematic and an event itinerary. "It is the annual Global Defense Contractors Gala. It is the biggest geopolitical networking event of the year. Every major weapons manufacturer, half the Senate Armed Services Committee, and dozens of international journalists will be in attendance." I stared at the screen, analyzing the high-profile guest list. "Why is this the perfect target?" "Because of the keynote presentation," DeAndre replied, tapping a specific line on the digital schedule. Tomorrow night at exactly 9 o'clock, Colonel Mitchell is receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for his oversight of the military supply chain. And Bradley Hayes, as his primary civilian contractor and close personal friend, is giving the introductory speech. The pieces fell into place with absolute terrifying clarity. Bradley and Mitchell would be in the exact same room surrounded by live news cameras, international reporters, and high-ranking government officials who were not on their payroll. It was their moment of supreme triumph. It was the exact moment they believed themselves to be completely untouchable. They will have Secret Service and elite private military contractors locking down every single entrance. I noted studying the building schematics. Metal detectors, biometric scanners, facial recognition software linked directly to the guest list. It is a suicide mission. DeAndre agreed, his voice deadpan. If we get caught at the perimeter, Mitchell's men will pull us into a back security room and put a bullet in our heads before the Metro Police even know we are in the building. Then we do not get caught at the perimeter, I said, my voice hardening into steel. We bypass the security grid entirely. DeAndre, you can spoof the credential database, right? I can rewrite the digital guest list. DeAndre confirmed, his fingers already flying across the keyboard to map out the network intrusion. I can fabricate high-level press credentials and backdate them through secure proxy servers so they look completely legitimate. But I cannot fake the physical security measures. You will still have to walk through a gauntlet of heavily armed men who possess your photograph on an active federal arrest warrant. I will handle the physical breach, I said, formulating the tactical diversion in my mind. We need to hijack the main audiovisual feed in the Great Hall. During Bradley's speech, we override the teleprompter and the massive projection screens. We broadcast the unredacted ledger, the offshore account transfers, and the audio files of Mitchell authorizing the bribe payment simultaneously to every screen in the building. We forced the entire room to witness their treason live. I turned around in the passenger seat, looking directly at Madison. She was huddled in the middle seat, shivering from the cold, clutching her ruined designer coat around her frame. She had lost her penthouse, her trust fund, and the father she thought she knew. The entire world was hunting her. She looked incredibly small, completely defeated. But beneath the raw terror in her bloodshot eyes, I saw something else burning. I saw the distinct spark of absolute, unadulterated rage. This is not a rescue mission anymore, I told her, making sure she understood the lethal gravity of what we were about to do. We are going to walk into a room filled with the most powerful and dangerous men in the country. If we fail, I go to a black site, DeAndre disappears, and you take the fall for a $70 million treason plot. They will lock you in a federal cage and throw away the key. Madison stared at me, her breathing shallow and ragged. I cannot protect you from this reality. I continued, my voice firm, refusing to offer false comfort. Your father built a weapon and he aimed it directly at your chest. Are you ready to stop being the victim and fight back? Madison sat in absolute silence for 5 agonizing seconds. The roaring heater of the stolen van fought a losing battle against the frozen Virginia night. She looked down at her trembling hands. She looked at the laptop screen displaying the faces of the men who had callously planned to sacrifice her. Then slowly, Madison reached up and wiped the tears from her pale cheeks. Her shoulders straightened. The posture of a frightened, manipulated child vanished completely, replaced by a fierce, rigid determination that mirrored my own. She raised her chin, locking her eyes onto mine with a cold, lethal focus. Tell me what to do, Mom. The ultimatum hung in the freezing air of the van, a final desperate threat from a man who thought he held all the cards. I did not answer him. I crushed the satellite phone beneath my boot, shattering the casing, and turned to DeAndre. Drive us to Washington, I ordered, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the cabin. We have a gala to attend. 24 hours later, the National Building Museum stood like a fortress of 19th-century brick and soaring Corinthian columns, currently locked down tighter than a military black site. The annual Global Defense Contractors Gala was the crown jewel of the military-industrial complex, a closed-door gathering where geopolitical power and vast wealth intersected. Tonight, it was also the designated stage for Colonel Mitchell to receive the Distinguished Service Medal, with Bradley delivering the keynote introduction. It was the perfect, heavily monitored venue. If we tried to expose them in the shadows, they would execute us. We had to drag them into the blinding light. DeAndre adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He looked like old money playing the role of a high-level forensic financial consultant with the legitimate corporate credentials to match. Beside him, Madison wore a sleek, understated black evening gown procured with untraceable cash. The physical transformation was striking, but the shift in her demeanor was absolute. She was no longer the sheltered, terrified girl shivering in a Virginia motel room. She walked with cold, calculated purpose, her posture perfectly mirroring the military bearing I had drilled into my own recruits. The perimeter was a gauntlet of district police and private security. DeAndre confidently presented his VIP invitation to the heavily armed guards blocking the grand entrance. The head of security scanned the biometric code, cross-referencing it with DeAndre's legitimate corporate front. "Welcome, Mr. Vance," the guard said, the tablet flashing a solid green. He turned his attention to Madison. "And you're +1. Madison stared the guard dead in the eyes, her facial features perfectly composed as the overhead camera scanned her face. Bradley had assumed we were running for the border. He had not placed his own daughter on the active federal ban list for his personal victory lap. The system chimed in automated approval. DeAndre offered his arm and they stepped through the gilded doors into the Great Hall. I was not walking through the front door. Every federal agency in the country was actively hunting Major Rebecca Thorne, and my biometric markers would trigger an immediate tactical lockdown. I approached the service loading docks at the rear of the museum, the freezing rain masking my movements. The alleyway was a chaotic mix of catering trucks and event staff, but the security was not standard. I recognized the stance, the tactical earpieces, the concealed shoulder holsters. Colonel Mitchell had deployed his Black Ops mercenaries to supplement the event staff, ensuring no uninvited federal agents could crash the party. I observed the blind spots in the rotating camera sweeps. A lone mercenary guarded the steel door leading to the subterranean utility corridors, a thermal scanner gripped tightly in his right hand. He was my ticket inside. I picked up a discarded stainless steel serving tray from a catering cart and stepped out of the shadows, keeping my head bowed to obscure my face. The mercenary raised a hand, his other reaching beneath his tailored jacket for his weapon. "Hold it right there. Authorized personnel only." He never finished the sentence. I lunged forward, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. I drove the heavy edge of the steel tray sharply upward, striking him directly in the larynx. He choked, his hands flying to his throat as his airway violently spasmed. I swept his left leg out from under him, catching his dropping weight against my chest to prevent a loud impact. I lowered him silently to the wet concrete, dragged him behind a stack of industrial dumpsters, and stripped the RFID security badge from his lapel. I keyed the card against the reader. The heavy steel door clicked open. I was in. I moved like a ghost through the subterranean utility tunnels, navigating the labyrinth of pipes and electrical conduits toward the primary audiovisual control room. Above me, the gala was in full swing. In the great hall, the scene was a masterclass in opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of elite guests. Senators, four-star generals, and billionaire defense contractors mingled over champagne and caviar. DeAndre navigated the sea of tailored suits, slowly working his way toward the central networking hub. Under the guise of checking his phone, he was actively running a localized intrusion script, hunting for a backdoor into the museum's heavily encrypted projection system. Madison's objective was infinitely more dangerous. She had to become the ultimate distraction. She separated from DeAndre, walking deliberately toward the center of the room. Bradley Hayes stood near the edge of the grand staircase, holding court with two high-ranking members of the Armed Services Committee. He was wearing a flawless tuxedo, a crystal glass in his hand, laughing effortlessly. He looked completely unburdened, a man entirely confident that he had successfully buried his treason, secured his billions, and framed his own flesh and blood. Then the crowd shifted. Bradley turned his head, his smile still plastered on his face, and his gaze locked directly onto Madison. The color drained from Bradley's face instantly. The crystal glass in his hand trembled, spilling a drop of champagne onto the marble floor. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, revealing the terrified, cornered animal underneath. He quickly excused himself from the senators, his strides aggressive and rigid as he crossed the ballroom floor. He intercepted Madison near a towering floral arrangement, stepping into her personal space to block her from view. His hand shot out, his fingers digging brutally into her upper arm, his grip a vice of pure, desperate panic. "What are you doing here?" Bradley hissed, his voice a venomous, panicked whisper meant only for her ears. "Where is the drive? You are coming with me right now, right?" He yanked her arm, expecting her to yield. He expected the compliant, terrified daughter he had manipulated her entire life. He expected her to quietly follow him into the shadows. Instead, Madison dug her heels firmly into the marble floor. She ripped her arm out of his grasp with violent, sudden force. The abrupt motion knocked a passing waiter, sending a heavy tray of crystal champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The shattering glass echoed like a gunshot, instantly silencing the surrounding crowd. Senators, generals, and elite contractors turned to stare. Madison did not shrink back. She did not lower her voice. She squared her shoulders, staring directly into her father's eyes, her voice ringing out clear and steady across the dead-silent ballroom. "Do not touch me, you traitor!" The silence that followed Madison's declaration was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the glittering ballroom. The ambient clinking of crystal and low hum of elite networking vanished. Every head turned toward the grand staircase. Bradley's grip on Madison's arm faltered for a fraction of a second, his perfectly manicured composure fracturing under the blinding weight of public exposure. He quickly recovered, stretching his mouth into a tight, condescending smile, intended to disarm the watching crowd. "My daughter has been under tremendous psychological distress," Bradley announced, his voice booming with artificial paternal concern. The acoustics of the great hall carried his lie to the furthest corners. "Please forgive this outburst. She is currently refusing medical treatment." He clamped his hand down on her wrist, again, his fingers digging into bone, attempting to drag her toward the side exit. "I am not sick!" Madison shouted, ripping her arm away with such force that Bradley stumbled. She stepped backward, positioning herself directly under the glare of a massive chandelier. "I am not having a breakdown, and you are not taking me anywhere. You set up the Cayman Shell companies. You funneled the Department of Defense logistics funds into the shadow trusts, and when the FBI got close, you forged a paper trail to frame me." The murmurs rippling through the crowd intensified into a frantic, buzzing wave. Senators exchanged alarmed glances. Foreign dignitaries whispered furiously to their translators. The word embezzlement hissed through the room like a lit fuse. Bradley's face darkened into a mask of pure lethal fury. He took a menacing step toward her, dropping the concerned father act completely. "Shut your mouth right now, Madison," he hissed, a guttural threat meant only for her. "Or I will bury you so deep you will never see daylight." "You already tried that," Madison replied, her voice steady, loud, and carrying a terrifying finality. "I do not have the hard drives, Bradley. I never had them. But I know exactly where the money went, and I know exactly who helped you steal it." From across the vast expanse of the ballroom, the sea of tailored suits parted. Colonel Mitchell marched toward the commotion, his chest heavy with military ribbons, his face set in stone. He signaled to two massive earpiece-wearing private military contractors flanking the room. They began moving methodically through the crowd, closing in on Madison from a tactical pincer formation. Before Mitchell or his men could reach her, DeAndre stepped seamlessly out of the crowd. He slid perfectly between Bradley and Madison, buttoning his tuxedo jacket with casual, arrogant authority. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Hayes?" DeAndre asked, his voice smooth, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who belonged in rooms exactly like this. "My firm is currently auditing the structural integrity of your offshore portfolios. Ms. Hayes was just providing me with some fascinating insight regarding your recent corporate restructuring." Bradley stared at DeAndre, his mind racing to identify the threat. Mitchell arrived a second later, his hand resting casually but menacingly on the hilt of his concealed sidearm. "Secure her," Mitchell ordered his contractors, his voice a low rumble. "Escort her to the holding suite. Now." As the ballroom above descended into a high-stakes standoff, I navigated the claustrophobic concrete utility tunnels beneath the floorboards. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth. I moved with lethal efficiency, tracking the thick bundles of fiber optic cables running along the ceiling. They all converged on a single point, the primary audiovisual control room. I rounded a sharp corner and spotted the heavy steel door. It was locked down with a retinal scanner, but the physical hinges were exposed. I retrieved a compact magnetic lockpick from my tactical belt, slapped it against the electronic strike plate, and forced a localized short circuit. The heavy deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying clack. I slipped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the frantic pulsing glow of dozens of high-definition monitors. The screens displayed every angle of the gala above, including a tight zoom on Madison holding her ground against Mitchell and Bradley. The massive main broadcast server rack hummed aggressively in the center of the cramped space. I moved to the primary terminal. My fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard, bypassing the standard firewalls and forcing open a direct upload directory. I pulled the decrypted micro SD card from my pocket and jammed it into the server's primary port. A green progress bar appeared on the screen, initiating the override sequence. It needed exactly 90 seconds to hijack the external video feeds and lock out the museum's control protocols. I did not hear the door open behind me. Major Rebecca Thorne. I spun around. A private military contractor stood in the doorway, his tactical flashlight blinding me. He was massive, clad in heavy Kevlar, and he recognized me instantly from the federal most wanted bulletins. He did not reach for his radio. He reached for his suppressed sidearm, intending to execute me and collect the bounty directly from Mitchell. I dropped to the floor a fraction of a second before the suppressed gunshot coughed through the room. The bullet shattered a computer monitor exactly where my chest had been. I swept my leg out, striking his knee joint with crushing force. The mercenary grunted, his leg buckling, but he maintained his grip on the weapon. He swung the heavy gun downward. I rolled sideways, hearing the sickening thud of the weapon cracking against the metal server rack. I launched myself upward, driving my elbow into his sternum. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he was heavily armored. He retaliated with a brutal backhanded strike across my face. The force of the blow snapped my head back. Blood instantly flooded my mouth, hot and metallic. My vision swam, but my tactical training took over. I ignored the blinding pain, grabbing his gun arm with both hands and twisting it violently outward until the joint popped. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding under a desk. The mercenary roared in anger. He slammed me backward into the heavy steel server rack. The breath exploded from my lungs. He lunged forward, wrapping his massive gloved hands around my throat. He was trying to crush my windpipe, his eyes burning with lethal intent. I gagged, black spots dancing in my peripheral vision. The progress bar on the monitor behind him ticked upward. 80%, 85%. I had seconds before I blacked out. I reached up, dug my thumbs into the sensitive pressure points behind his ears, and drove my knee savagely into his groin. His grip loosened just enough for me to gasp a ragged breath. I slipped under his arms, twisted my body around, and locked my arms securely around his neck in a flawless, blood-choking hold. He thrashed wildly, slamming my back against the server racks, desperately trying to dislodge me. I tightened the grip, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. We crashed into the control desk, sending keyboards and coffee cups flying. He clawed at my arms, his movements growing frantic, then sluggish, then completely limp. I held the choke for 3 more seconds to ensure he was fully incapacitated, then let his heavy body slide to the floor. I collapsed against the desk, gasping for air, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the linoleum. Every muscle in my body screamed in agony, my ribs bruised and my face throbbing. I dragged myself up and leaned heavily against the primary terminal. On the central monitor, the chaotic scene in the ballroom had shifted. Madison and DeAndre were surrounded by guards, but the sheer number of watching senators had forced Mitchell to temporarily back down. The scheduled programming had to continue to maintain the illusion of control. The lights in the Great Hall dimmed. The massive projector screens behind the grand stage flared to life, displaying the pristine patriotic logo of the Global Defense Contractors Gala. Colonel Mitchell walked up the velvet-lined stairs to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, his posture radiating absolute authority and untouchable power. The crowd quieted down, waiting for the keynote speech that would cement his legacy. I stared at the blinking green prompt on the terminal screen. The upload was complete. The override sequence was primed. I wiped the blood from my chin, leaving a red smear across the back of my hand, and hovered my finger over the keyboard. I hit enter. The heavy keystroke echoed in the cramped control room with the finality of a judge's gavel. The command executed instantly, bypassing the museum's localized network architecture and seizing absolute control of the mainframe. On the bank of glowing monitors in front of me, the green progress bars vanished, replaced by the raw, unencrypted feed of the offshore ledger. Above me in the Great Hall, the transformation was spectacular and entirely unforgiving. Colonel Mitchell stood at the mahogany podium, his chest puffed out, a row of military service ribbons gleaming under the warm golden spotlights. He gripped the edges of the lectern, smiling down at the 500 elite guests, preparing to deliver a meticulously crafted speech about patriotism, honor, and sacrifice. He waited for the sweeping orchestral music and the slick, high-production tribute video to begin playing on the massive 60-foot projection screens suspended behind the stage. Instead, the screens snapped to a blinding stark white. The polite, expectant silence in the ballroom evaporated as black text began scrolling rapidly across the massive displays. These were not redacted summaries or carefully worded legal allegations. These were the raw, irrefutable offshore ledger files. The corporate logos of Cayman Island banks, Zurich shadow trusts, and Panamanian holding companies flashed in brilliant high definition. The routed amounts appeared in bold, glaring red font. 12 million, 25 million, $70 million, systematically diverted from Department of Defense logistics funds into private untraceable shell accounts. And at the bottom of each magnified wire transfer authorization, two signatures were displayed side by side, clear as day, Bradley Hayes and Colonel Arthur Mitchell. The visual shock was only the first wave of the assault. The museum's state-of-the-art surround sound system, calibrated for acoustic perfection, crackled to life. It bypassed the podium microphone, entirely hijacking the main amplifier banks. Bradley's voice, arrogant, unhurried, and crystal clear, echoed off the 19th century brick walls and soared into the vaulted ceilings. "We route the supply funds through the shell companies in Cyprus." Arthur Bradley's recorded voice boomed, the bass shaking the floorboards. "Just like we practiced. You sign off on the fabricated artillery shipments, I wash the cash through the defense contracts, and we both retire with 9 figures." The reaction of the 500 elite guests was a cascading wave of pure, unfiltered chaos. The polished decorum of the gala shattered instantly. Senators and congressmen who had been smiling and raising their glasses moments ago physically recoiled. They shoved their chairs back, spilling champagne across pristine white tablecloths, desperate to put physical distance between themselves and the two men implicated on the screens. International journalists attending the gala to cover a standard, boring military networking event instantly realized they were witnessing the biggest geopolitical scandal of the decade. A sea of smartphones shot into the air. Camera flashes erupted in a blinding strobe effect. Live news crews abandoned their designated press pens, forcibly shoving their way through the panicked crowd to turn their broadcast lenses directly onto the screens and then onto Mitchell. The audio broadcast did not stop. It cut to a second file, and Mitchell's own recorded voice thundered through the ballroom, sealing his fate with brutal precision. "Make sure the girl takes the fall if the feds look too closely at the logistics chain," Mitchell's voice commanded. "Your daughter is the designated proxy, Bradley. Ensure the paper trail leads directly to her desk. We need a fall guy, and she is perfectly positioned." In the center of the ballroom, the blood vanished completely from Bradley Hayes's face. His jaw slackened. The untouchable billionaire defense contractor, the man who controlled politicians and private armies, was suddenly stripped bare in the blinding spotlight. He released his vice-like grip on Madison's arm as if her skin had suddenly caught fire. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the grand exits, but the doors were already jammed with fleeing politicians and shouting reporters. His empire, built on decades of ruthless manipulation, was burning to the ground in front of the entire world. DeAndre stepped smoothly in front of Madison, shielding her from the crushing, unpredictable surge of the panicked crowd. He kept his posture rigid and alert, his eyes scanning the room for the inevitable violent reaction. On the stage, Colonel Mitchell stood entirely paralyzed. The illusion of his absolute power evaporated in real time. He frantically slammed his hand against the podium microphone, shouting for his security detail to cut the feed, but the microphone was dead. His desperate commands were drowned out by his own recorded treason, playing on a continuous, inescapable loop above his head. Mitchell looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the journalists broadcasting his ruin live to millions of viewers. He saw the high-ranking generals, his peers and superiors, staring at him with undisguised disgust and fury. The private military contractors he had hired to secure the perimeter were frozen in confusion, unsure of who to protect or who to shoot now that their employer was officially unmasked as a traitor. The realization hit Mitchell with the force of a physical blow. There would be no backroom deals to save him. There would be no quiet, forced resignation or honorable discharge. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal maximum security penitentiary, stripped of his rank, his wealth, and his freedom. The panic in Mitchell's eyes hardened into something feral and utterly unhinged. The rational, calculating military tactician vanished, replaced by a cornered animal operating on pure, desperate adrenaline. His gaze swept wildly across the chaotic ballroom floor, tracking over the fleeing guests and the flashing cameras until his eyes locked onto Bradley. And then, standing right beside him, he saw Madison, the designated proxy, the girl who had refused to play her part and had helped orchestrate his destruction. Mitchell reached swiftly beneath his tailored dress jacket. He drew his polished service sidearm, a heavy semi-automatic pistol, and racked the slide with a violent jerk. The metallic clack pierced through the screaming crowd. He leveled the barrel directly at Madison's chest, his hands shaking with blind rage. "It is a lie!" Mitchell roared, his voice cracking hysterically over the din of the panicked crowd. "It is a deep fake. Nobody move or the girl dies." Mitchell's finger pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot was a physical force in the cavernous great hall, a sharp, violent detonation that instantly shattered the gilded illusion of the Global Defense Contractors Gala. Madison stood frozen, her eyes wide-locked in the fatal trajectory of a desperate man with nothing left to lose. But DeAndre was already in motion. He did not hesitate to calculate the risk or preserve his own cover. He launched his entire body forward with explosive speed, abandoning his position in the crowd to intercept the line of fire. He collided with Mitchell exactly as the weapon discharged. The blinding muzzle flash illuminated the surrounding faces of horrified dignitaries in a stark momentary strobe. The raw, kinetic impact of DeAndre's tackle knocked Mitchell's aim wildly off-center. Instead of burying itself in Madison's chest, the high-velocity round tore through the tailored fabric of DeAndre's midnight blue tuxedo, ripping a deep, burning groove across the thick muscle of his left shoulder. DeAndre let out a sharp, guttural grunt of agony, but his momentum carried them both. He drove his weight into Mitchell's torso, sending them crashing violently onto the polished marble floor. The heavy service pistol skittered away, spinning across the stone tiles and disappearing beneath a banquet table. Mitchell fought with the feral, unhinged intensity of a man staring down a lifetime in a federal maximum security penitentiary. He threw a brutal, desperate elbow into DeAndre's ribs, attempting to scramble out from under the heavier man. Blood soaked through DeAndre's torn jacket, staining the white marble beneath them, but the financial consultant did not yield. Operating on pure adrenaline, DeAndre wrapped his uninjured right arm around Mitchell's throat in a flawless, vice-like sleeper hold. He clamped down, using his superior leverage to pin the disgraced military commander flat against the floor. The elite private military contractors hired to secure the perimeter with lethal force watched their commanding officer brawling in a pool of blood while his treason broadcasted in high definition on a 60-foot screen above their heads. They made a collective, unspoken tactical decision. They lowered their weapons, raised their empty hands, and stepped backward into the shadows. They were highly paid mercenaries, not martyrs for a burning empire. The single gunshot ignited absolute primal bedlam. 500 of the nation's most powerful senators, generals, and billionaire defense contractors abandoned their high society decorum in a fraction of a second. They screamed, shoving each other aside with ruthless self-preservation as they stampeded toward the grand exits. Towering displays of exotic orchids and crystal champagne pyramids crashed to the floor, shattering into thousands of glittering shards that crunched beneath trampling patent leather shoes and designer heels. The elegant gala had rapidly devolved into a chaotic riot of survival. Bradley Hayes did not look back. He did not look at his daughter, who stood trembling but unharmed in the center of the room. He did not look at Colonel Mitchell, currently being choked out on the floor. Bradley's survival instinct, sharpened by decades of ruthless corporate maneuvering, completely overrode any lingering human connection. He saw the security perimeter fracturing under the weight of the panicked crowd and recognized his only window of opportunity. He spun around and sprinted toward the VIP side exit. He aggressively shoved a foreign ambassador out of his path, his eyes locked onto the heavy brass-studded oak doors leading to the private subterranean parking garage. He had an untraceable jet fueled and waiting on a private tarmac in Maryland. He had shadow accounts that Mitchell knew nothing about. He just needed to clear the building. He just needed to reach that door. Bradley was exactly 10 feet away from the exit when the heavy oak doors violently burst inward, thrown open with enough force to crack the plaster on the adjacent walls. They did not open for him. Dozens of heavily armored figures flooded into the great hall, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. They wore tactical gear emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. DeAndre had not merely spoofed the museum's security matrix to get Madison inside. He had anonymously transmitted the unredacted offshore ledger, the decrypted audio files, and Bradley's exact GPS coordinates to the director of the FBI's Anti-Corruption Task Force 3 hours before the gala even began. He had primed the trap perfectly. The public broadcast was simply the undeniable confirmation they needed to execute the raid. Federal agents swarmed the ballroom. Their tactical rifles raised their voices, cutting through the shrieks of the crowd with booming commands to get down on the floor. Bradley froze, his escape route entirely blocked by a solid wall of federal tactical vests. He spun around frantically, searching for another exit, searching for a shadow to slip into, a bribe to offer, a lie to spin. There were no shadows left. The blinding lights of the international news cameras were fixed directly on him, broadcasting his panic to the world. 2 massive FBI agents closed the distance in a dead sprint. Bradley raised his hands, opening his mouth to negotiate to leverage his political connections. The agents did not give him the chance. They hit him with the combined force of a freight train. Bradley was thrown completely off his feet. His chest slammed brutally against the unforgiving marble floor, knocking the breath entirely from his lungs with a sickening thud. An agent drove a heavy armored knee directly into Bradley's spine, pinning him flat while violently wrenching his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, biting deeply into his skin. His face was pressed hard against the cold stone, resting directly in a puddle of spilled champagne and shattered crystal. I stepped out of the subterranean service elevator and walked slowly into the great hall. The chaos of the raid was still unfolding, but the dynamic of the room had fundamentally altered. Mitchell was successfully restrained by DeAndre and surrounded by federal agents. Madison stood near the center of the room, completely unharmed, watching the destruction of her father's empire with cold, unblinking clarity. I was a physical wreck. My tactical gear was torn at the seams. My knuckles were split and bleeding freely, and a dark, heavy bruise was already blooming across my jawline from the brutal close-quarters fight in the control room. But as I walked across the ballroom floor, my posture was perfectly straight. My head was held high. The crowd of terrified elites and armed federal agents subconsciously parted, clearing a wide, silent path for me. They looked up at the massive screens which were still broadcasting the undeniable evidence of my innocence, and then they looked down at me. I was no longer a wanted fugitive hunted by the state. I was the architect of the greatest public takedown in modern political history. I walked deliberately, my heavy boots crunching loudly over the broken glass, until I reached the exact spot where Bradley Hayes was pinned to the floor. The FBI agents looked up at me, recognized my face from the screens, and stepped back just a fraction of an inch, allowing me the space I had earned. Bradley strained his neck, twisting his head painfully to look up at me. His pristine tuxedo was ruined, soaked in alcohol and dirt. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. The absolute arrogant superiority that had defined him for a decade was completely eradicated, replaced by the hollow, frantic terror of a man who finally realized he had lost everything. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him. I stood over him, feeling the heavy, freezing weight of the last week finally lift from my shoulders. I looked down at the man who had tried to frame me, who had tried to destroy his own daughter, and who had believed he was entirely untouchable. Merry Christmas, Bradley. Bradley did not say a word. He could not. The breath had been driven from his lungs, but even if he could speak, the absolute totality of his ruin had paralyzed his vocal cords. He stared up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his face pressed against the cold marble amidst the ruined remnants of his gala. The FBI agents flanking him did not offer the billionaire any of his accustomed deference. They hauled him roughly to his feet by the chains of his handcuffs, his expensive tuxedo tearing at the shoulder. They spun him around and marched him toward the exit. A few feet away, Colonel Mitchell was being dragged across the floor by 4 heavily armed agents. He had regained a terrifying feral consciousness, thrashing against his restraints and spitting blood onto the pristine floor tiles. He was shouting incoherent threats, his military discipline completely shattered, but his voice was swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the raid. The commanding officer of one of the nation's most elite private military forces was unceremoniously shoved into the back of an armored transport vehicle, just another disgraced criminal heading to federal lockup. I turned away from them and moved toward the center of the ballroom. Flashing red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles outside pulsed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting erratic shadows across the Great Hall. Paramedics had pushed through the federal barricade and were clustered near the grand staircase. DeAndre was sitting slumped against a marble pillar. His face was tight with pain, but his posture remained defiantly casual. An EMT was cutting away the ruined fabric of his bespoke jacket to expose the angry bleeding graze across his left shoulder. "Do not use the cheap gauze," DeAndre told the medic, wincing as a heavy dose of antiseptic was applied to the wound. "I have a very specific skincare routine, and someone owes me $6,000 for this suit." Madison was kneeling on the floor right beside him. She was not crying. She was not panicking. The sheltered girl who had been terrified of her own shadow a week ago was holding a compressed bandage against DeAndre's shoulder with steady, blood-stained hands. She looked up as I approached, her expression reflecting a profound, hardened clarity. We had dragged her into a war zone, and she had emerged as a survivor. "You took a bullet for her," I said, looking down at DeAndre. He offered a weak, pain-laced smile. "It was a calculated risk. Plus, you need my financial expertise to decipher the rest of those offshore accounts. You cannot let your lead auditor bleed out on a museum floor." Before I could reply, a shrill, hysterical scream pierced the ambient noise of the secure perimeter. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who my husband is?" Caroline Hayes was attempting to breach the main entrance. She had likely arrived late to the gala, planning to make a fashionable, highly photographed entrance. Instead, she was standing in the center of a federal crime scene wearing a gown that cost more than a suburban home, her face twisted in aristocratic outrage. 2 FBI agents blocked her path, their expressions entirely devoid of sympathy. "Where is Bradley?" Caroline demanded, her voice shrill enough to crack glass. "I am calling the governor. I am calling the attorney general. You have no right to occupy our event." A senior federal agent stepped forward holding a digital tablet. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband is currently en route to a federal holding facility facing charges of treason, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. Furthermore, as of 10 minutes ago, the United States Treasury Department has executed a total asset freeze on all accounts associated with Hayes Industries, including your personal domestic trusts, your offshore holdings, and your real estate portfolio." Caroline froze. Her perfectly manicured hands dropped to her sides. "Your black cards are declined," the agent continued, his voice brutally clinical. Your properties are being seized as evidence of financial crimes. You have absolutely nothing left, Mrs. Hayes. You will need to step back behind the barricade. The color drained from Caroline's face. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch of the Hayes dynasty crumbled in real time. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the wet pavement outside the museum doors, sobbing hysterically into her hands as the news cameras pivoted to capture her total social and financial destruction. The dismantling of their empire was thorough and perfectly synchronized. As the paramedics loaded DeAndre onto a stretcher for transport, the FBI team leader approached me. He tapped his earpiece, listening to a secure channel before nodding in my direction. "We just got confirmation from the field office," the agent said. "The raid on the Four Seasons was a success." Vanessa Hayes had thought she was the smartest player on the board. She had cut a plea deal with the Department of Justice, throwing Bradley under the bus in exchange for full immunity. She had been sitting in a luxury penthouse suite sipping champagne, waiting for the dust to settle, so she could inherit the remnants of the company. But DeAndre's data dump had changed the rules. The raw server files we broadcasted to the world explicitly proved that Vanessa had personally initiated the Cayman Island wire transfers. She had lied to federal investigators about her involvement in the offshore accounts. Her immunity was instantly voided. The tactical team had breached her hotel suite doors without knocking. The agent informed me that Vanessa had been dragged through the lobby of the Four Seasons in handcuffs, screaming and threatening to sue the entire federal government, while tourists filmed the entire humiliating spectacle. The immediate threats were neutralized. The conspirators were in custody. But I was still a fugitive standing in a room full of federal agents. The team leader looked at me with a mixture of respect and procedural obligation. He unclipped a pair of heavy zip ties from his tactical vest. "Major Thorne, you know how this works. You are still technically listed on the federal database. I need you to surrender your sidearm and place your hands behind your back." I did not argue. I drew my weapon, placed it carefully on a nearby table, and turned around. The heavy plastic restraints bit into my wrists. I stood quietly as the remaining gala guests were ushered out, watching the forensic teams begin their methodical sweep of the ballroom. I had accomplished the mission. The consequences for my own freedom were secondary. The heavy oak doors of the great hall swung open once more. The chaotic noise of the room instantly dropped to an eerie, respectful hush. The federal agents surrounding me immediately straightened their posture, stepping back to clear a path. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked across the room. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and an expression carved from granite. He bypassed the forensic teams, ignored the senior agents, and walked straight up to me. He stopped looking at my bruised face and my bound hands. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy pair of trauma shears. Without a word, he stepped behind me and sliced through the thick plastic zip ties. My hands fell free. The director reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small, familiar leather wallet. He held it out to me. I opened it. It was my military identification card, the one that had been stripped from me when the false treason charges were filed. The director met my eyes, his tone deadly serious. "The Secretary of Defense wants to see you in the morning, Major." 7 days passed in a relentless blur of windowless debriefing rooms, polygraph examinations, and heavily guarded tactical reviews. The raw data DeAndre had pulled from the offshore servers proved to be the single most destructive piece of forensic evidence in modern military history. It did not just implicate Colonel Mitchell and Bradley Hayes. It exposed a staggering rot that extended into the upper echelons of the Armed Services Committee and international defense logistics. Now I stood at perfect, rigid attention inside a classified tribunal chamber deep within the E-ring of the Pentagon. I wore my pristine Class A dress uniform, every ribbon precisely measured my brass polish to a blinding shine. The heavy oak doors were sealed shut, guarded by 2 armed military police officers. The bruises on my face had faded to a dull yellow, but my ribs still ached with every breath. I ignored the pain, keeping my eyes locked dead ahead. Across the expansive, polished mahogany table sat the Secretary of Defense. He was flanked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Director of National Intelligence. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the secretary turning a page in the thick, red-stamped dossier resting in front of him. Major Thorne, the secretary, began his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant respect. The breadth of the conspiracy you uncovered is entirely unprecedented. As of this morning, we have frozen over $2 billion in illicit defense funds. 3 sitting senators are currently in federal custody. Colonel Mitchell is facing a closed military tribunal for high treason, and your ex-husband is being held without bail in a maximum security federal facility. I did not speak. I remained at the position of attention, my face a mask of military discipline. The secretary closed the folder and folded his hands over it. You bypassed the chain of command. You assaulted federal contractors. You orchestrated a highly publicized cyber intrusion of a civilian event and evaded federal capture for weeks. By every standard metric of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you should be facing a court-martial. He paused, letting the heavy weight of his words settle in the sterile air of the room. However, the secretary continued, his tone shifting from clinical to profoundly serious. The chain of command was fundamentally compromised. You operated with extraordinary tactical precision under impossible hostile conditions. You did not just expose a financial crime. You neutralized a catastrophic threat to the operational integrity of the United States Armed Forces. You saved lives, Major. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth mahogany wood. It came to rest directly in front of me. That is an official federal decree, the chairman stated. The charges of treason, insubordination, and theft against you have been formally dropped and completely expunged from the record. Furthermore, Madison Hayes has been entirely cleared of all federal financial crimes. The forensic auditors confirmed that the digital paper trail was fabricated by Bradley Hayes to utilize her as a proxy shield. Her name is clean. She is free. A massive, suffocating weight evaporated from my chest. The singular goal that had driven me through the blood, the freezing nights, and the desperate violence was finally achieved. Madison was safe. Bradley could never touch her again. I kept my posture rigid, but I allowed myself a slow, deep exhale. "Thank you, sir," I said, my voice steady. "We are not finished," the secretary said. He stood up from his leather chair. The other generals followed suit, rising to their feet in perfect unison. The secretary reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a small, velvet-lined box. He walked around the large table, his heavy footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, and stopped directly in front of me. "The Republic owes you a debt that cannot be adequately repaid in commendations," the secretary said, his eyes meeting mine with absolute sincerity. "But we can start by ensuring that officers of your caliber are in the positions necessary to prevent this from ever happening again." He opened the small velvet box. Resting against the dark fabric was a pair of gleaming silver oak leaves. "Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne," he said. He pinned the new rank to my uniform lapels. I snapped a razor-sharp salute. The secretary and the generals returned the gesture, a silent, profound acknowledgement of respect from the highest military authority in the nation. "Dismissed, Colonel," the secretary said. I executed a crisp about-face and marched toward the heavy oak doors. The military police officers pulled them open, and I stepped out into the vast, bustling corridors of the Pentagon. The chaotic noise of the military headquarters washed over me, but for the first time in weeks, I was not looking over my shoulder. I was not calculating escape routes or analyzing blind spots. I walked with the measured, confident stride of a free woman. I navigated the labyrinthine hallways, passed through the intensive security checkpoints, and finally pushed through the heavy glass doors of the main exit. The crisp, freezing winter air hit my face instantly, clean and sharp. The mid-morning sun reflected brilliantly off the white concrete and the distant dark waters of the Potomac River. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the freezing air, feeling the absolute reality of my survival. I walked down the wide concrete steps toward the designated visitor pickup zone. Parked near the curb was a sleek black sedan. Leaning casually against the passenger door was Madison. She wore a heavy wool coat over a simple sweater and jeans. The designer gowns and the terrified, hunted posture of the girl I had dragged out of a Virginia motel room were completely gone. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, projecting a quiet, unshakable strength. She held two large, steaming paper cups in her hands. She looked up as I approached. A genuine warm smile broke across her face, reaching her eyes and erasing the shadows of the past month. The heavy, suffocating, awkward tension that had defined our relationship for the last 15 years had completely vanished, burned away by the fire we had walked through together. "I got you black, no sugar," Madison said, holding out one of the cups. "Just how you like it." I took the coffee, feeling the intense heat radiate through the cardboard sleeve. I looked at my daughter, truly seeing the incredible, resilient woman she had become. "Thank you," I said. She bumped her shoulder gently against my uninjured arm. "You ready to go home, Mom?" I took a sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. "Yes," I replied, unlocking the car doors. "I am exactly where I need to be." Exactly 365 days later, the world looked completely different. The blinding flashbulbs, the deafening police sirens, and the cold, unforgiving marble floors of the Global Defense Contractors Gala had been entirely replaced by the quiet, steady crackle of a wood-burning fireplace. My Virginia home was nestled deep in the Shenandoah Valley, surrounded by acres of dense, snow-covered pine trees. There were no private underground elevators here. There was no imported Italian marble, no crystal champagne pyramids, and absolutely no armed security details patrolling the perimeter. It was a rustic, sturdy cabin built from heavy timber and river stone. It smelled of wood smoke, roasted garlic, and real, untainted peace. DeAndre was sitting in a worn leather armchair near the hearth. He looked entirely out of his element, yet perfectly at ease. The immaculate $6,000 tailored suits had been traded for a thick, oversized cable-knit sweater and dark denim. His left arm rested comfortably on the armrest, fully healed and moving with complete, unhindered fluidity. The violent graze from Colonel Mitchell's high-velocity service weapon was now just a faded scar, a permanent physical reminder of the night we dismantled an empire. DeAndre was laughing. It was a rich, genuine sound that I had never heard during our time navigating the toxic, high-stakes labyrinth of the Hayes family hierarchy. He was completely free from Caroline's suffocating aristocratic toxicity. He was no longer a pawn in a billionaire's treacherous chess game, forced to carefully calculate every word and every movement to preserve his own survival and sanity. He was just a man enjoying Christmas Eve by a fire holding a glass of cheap, perfectly aged bourbon. In the kitchen, just a few feet away, Madison was humming softly over a cast-iron stove. The transformation in my daughter was nothing short of miraculous. The terrified, sheltered heir to a corrupt fortune had vanished entirely. She wore a simple, oversized green sweater with the sleeves pushed up past her elbows, a flour smudge dusted casually across her cheek, and her hair tied back in a messy knot. She was stirring a large pot of homemade marinara sauce, the rich, savory aroma filling the entire cabin. There were no private chefs catering to her every whim. There were no maids hovering in the background to clean up her messes or manage her schedule. Madison was doing the work herself, and she looked more radiant, more grounded, and more genuinely happy than I had ever seen her. The sharp, nervous tension that had tightly wound her shoulders for 15 years had completely dissolved. She was no longer a prop in Bradley's carefully curated public image. She was simply Madison. I leaned against the wooden archway separating the living room from the kitchen, watching them both. The heavy gold oak leaves of my lieutenant colonel rank were pinned to my dress uniform, hanging safely in the closet upstairs. Tonight, I was not the commanding officer who had orchestrated the most destructive federal raid in modern political history. I was just a mother watching her daughter thrive. Dinner was loud, chaotic, and wonderful. DeAndre recounted highly exaggerated stories of his new independent consulting firm, an operation that exclusively audited and exposed corrupt corporate ledgers for the federal government. Madison teased him relentlessly about his newfound highly suspicious obsession with chopping his own firewood, pointing out the blisters on his hands that had never seen a single day of manual labor before this winter. I sat at the head of the heavy wooden dining table, pouring wine and letting the warmth of the room wash over me. The awkward, painful chasm that had separated Madison and me for over a decade was entirely eradicated. We had crossed a deadly, terrifying battlefield together, relying on nothing but each other, and we had emerged on the other side as a true family. The shadows of Bradley and Caroline Hayes were permanently banished from our lives. As the evening wound down and DeAndre moved back to the living room to stoke the dying fire, Madison walked over to me. She was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. Her playful, relaxed demeanor had shifted into something quiet and profoundly serious. She stopped in front of me, her eyes bright and steady, and pressed the sealed envelope into my hands. "I did not want to show you this until it was completely finished," Madison said, her voice dropping to a soft, even register. "I submitted it to the university admissions board this morning." I looked down at the heavy paper. My fingers traced the sealed flap. I looked back up at her, silently asking for permission before breaking the seal. Madison nodded. I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of neatly printed pages. It was her primary college application essay, the critical piece of her academic future. She was not relying on the Hayes name, a massive financial endowment, or a fabricated legacy to secure her admission. She was relying on her own voice. I looked at the top of the first page. The bold centered text of the title commanded my immediate attention. "My Mother the Commander, How I Learned the True Price of Honor." My breath caught hard in my throat. I stared at the words, the black ink blurring slightly, as a sudden intense wave of emotion rushed behind my eyes. I read the first paragraph where Madison detailed not the staggering wealth of her father, but the absolute unyielding integrity of a soldier who had sacrificed everything to protect the truth. She wrote about the courage it took to stand alone against a corrupt empire. She wrote about me. Hot, unbidden tears filled my eyes, spilling over my lashes and tracing silent paths down my cheeks. I did not bother to wipe them away. The rigid military discipline that had guarded my emotions for decades shattered completely under the profound weight of her words. Madison did not hesitate. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, pulling me into a fierce, desperate embrace. I dropped the papers onto the wooden table and hugged my daughter back with everything I had. We stood there in the center of the warm, rustic kitchen, holding on to each other, surrounded by a genuine peace that could never be bought or stolen. I looked over Madison's shoulder, my gaze drifting past the warm glow of the room and settling on the large, frost-covered window panes. Outside, thick, heavy flakes of white snow were falling silently into the dark Virginia woods, burying the past and covering the earth in a clean, immaculate slate. You cannot demand respect from those who measure human worth with stolen dollars. You can only sharpen your blade in silence and wait for the day they walk blindly into the trap of their own greed. The most profound lesson here is that true security comes from within, not from external sources like relationships, jobs, or family approval. When toxic relatives try to undermine your potential, you must stop seeking their conditional acceptance. Validation ultimately comes from within, not from others' approval. Embracing complete independence allows you to transform painful betrayals into the sturdy foundation for an authentic, empowering life. You have the power to define your own success and walk away from those who drag you down. Please hit the like button and share your own experiences in the comments below.